The story begins in a bustling town, alive with adventurers coming and going at every turn. Among them stands a man named Rita Dixon, a fierce member of the C-rank adventure party known as the Jet Black Wolves. Drawn by admiration for the adventuring life, he came to the royal capital at 25. And now, 5 years later, he remains stuck at F-rank, the only one in the group who hasn't advanced. He isn't very compatible, but Rita shines in other ways. Across town, a young girl sits on the ground, clutching her knee and complaining that it hurts. Another kid laughs, mocks her for being weak, and says she'll be left behind. Rita sees what's happening and walks over. People quietly ask to take a look at the girl's knee. Tears on her face, he heals her, and the girl, amazed, feels the pain vanish. Rita gently tells her to keep it a secret. She happily agrees, waving and thanking him, and Rita reflects that his personal skill is heal. He had an item box, felt a pang of thirst, took a long pull from his flask as he walked, and wondered why Jill had suddenly summoned him to the tavern. He figured it was about advancing their party's rank. Finally, inside the tavern, Jill, leader of the Jet Black Wolves, gets straight to the point. He wants Rita to leave the party, and Rita, stunned, asks him to explain. Jill's face went cold as she told him not to pretend surprise. He said bluntly that Rita was fired, and Rita, still processing, asked what was going on, while Jill insisted it wasn't sudden. The party is aiming to move up from C to be rake. Rita admits she heard about the promotion, but wonders why that should lead to this. Jill snaps that she's only been useful as a stand-in for potions and as a baggage carrier. He doesn't want her holding the back anymore. Rita pleads, insisting he does provide support in his own way. Jill slams, then is cut down in anger. He says they've been working non-stop since childhood, while Rita only started in his mid-20s and already has an advanced single rank, so he should just disappear quietly. Calmer now, Jill demands that Rita return all the items entrusted him. When Rita tries to speak, Jill cuts him off, and he says they can't spare any equipment now that they're facing the challenge of B-rank advancement. Rita screams in desperation. Without those items, he simply couldn't do his job as an adventurer. Jill sneers, openly questioning whether Rita even qualifies as one. He tells him to go back to the countryside and become a farmer. Rita falls silent, clenching his fists. After a long, weary sigh, he accepts it. This is their farewell, and Jill dismisses him as useless, telling him to be gone. Rita turns and walks away without a word, and Jill, satisfied, yells that their promotion to B-rank is now certain, sarcastically thanking Rita, while Rita continues on in silence until a girl suddenly calls out to her in the street. It was Rincer, his lover. When she heard Rita had quit being an adventurer, she bluntly pointed out that he now had no income, and a heavy silence fell after that. She told him coldly that if that was the case, he was no longer any use to her, and she was ending their relationship. Rita, taken aback and trying to understand, heard Rincer mock how slow he was to catch on. If he had no money, there was no longer any reason to stay with him. When Rita reminded her of everything he'd done, she only asked casually if he meant the money. She insisted that if he had the privilege of dating someone as beautiful as her, paying her was only natural. Rita reminded him of the story she'd told about her debt-ridden parents, and pointed out that he'd wanted to help her family. Rincer laughed in his face, saying she hadn't seen her parents in years, and couldn't believe he actually believed that lie. She walked away and, with a cold little laugh, told him that of course she'd only ever been after his money. Should a date to go to? This time it was someone rich, someone far more capable than Rita. When Rita tried to stop her, she snapped at him not to speak to her again. Left behind, he stood there, whispering her name as she slipped from sight, while Rita, alone and devastated, was swallowed by the night in sorrow. By morning he was still in his room, sunk into his bed, and surrounded by a scatter of empty beer bottles. He came to slowly, rubbing his aching head and groaning with pain, wondering if he'd really drunk that much. The memories of the night before crashed back in, and he let out a bitter laugh, surprised he could still laugh at all. Slapping his cheeks, he forced himself to pull together. First he'd clean up, then he'd go find a new job. Later, at the Adventurers Guild Capital headquarters, Rita stepped inside with hope shining in her eyes. Just then a voice sliced through the air, calling to him. It was Syra, a staff member at the guild. Rita flinched at the suddenness and greeted her awkwardly. She urged him to follow her to the back and insisted that she wanted to hear about his situation, and he brushed off his concern about waiting in line. When they were alone, Syra stared in shock, unable to believe what Jill had done. She said firmly that Jill had missed something important. The guild had offered the rank up to the entire party, including Rita. Rita's surprise showed as Syra said that, rank aside, he had 2 priceless assets. One of them his healing magic stashed in his item box. Rita, still doubtful, pointed out that potions could replace healing magic and that his item box was only good for carrying things. Cyrus sighed deeply. It hit him how deeply Jill and the others must have manipulated him, using him like something they could throw away. She made it clear that his healing and his item box were both incredibly rare, and the guild knew exactly how valuable they were. She went on to say that if it weren't for the constant trouble caused by the jet black walls, Rita would likely have been promoted already. Rita sheepishly dismissed the idea. But Cyrus snapped, frustration boiling over as he yelled that he had no idea what he was worth. Rita tried to calm things down, gently reminding her that he had come only to find a job. Her cheeks flushed as Syrah apologized for snapping and gently nudged the conversation back on track. She slid him a list of open postings and pointed out that several groups were actively recruiting healers. As Rita scanned the listings, one small, out-of-place note looking for immigrants caught his eye. Syrah said it was just a stray flyer mixed in, and when Rita read that it was for the town of Amulus, he felt the weight of all he'd been through in the royal capital, and wondered if starting over somewhere else might not be so bad. With a new resolve burning in him, Rita declared he would head to Amulus, and Syrah, taken off guard, called out to him in surprise. Later that night, beneath a calm, quiet sky, Rita sat alone in the campfire's glow, beginning the next chapter of his journey. He sipped from his cup beneath the night sky as Rita quietly noted that, though spring was near, the nights were still cold, and he reminded himself there were 3 days left until they reached the amulets. He remembered how Syrah had first done everything to stop him from leaving, yet in the end she sent him off warmly, handing him a letter of introduction to the Amulus Guild because she had a good friend there, and even arranging for him to ride halfway in a merchant's carriage, and Rita thought of her with fondness. Opening his item box, he decided to treat himself. He planned to grill a thick cut of meat, grateful that the raw meat had stayed fresh in the box. He realized the box was far more useful than he'd ever given it credit for. He pulled out oil, milk, root vegetables, salt, pepper, and some bread. More than enough for a solid meal. As he cooked the meat in a pan, a low stomach growl echoed into the quiet night and Rita flinched. He had made that sound. Without thinking, he grabbed his knife and called out, voice low and careful, telling whoever was there to show themselves. After a long, tense silence, a figure slowly stepped out of the shadows. It was a young girl, her eyes blank, her clothes torn and ragged. Rita lowered his knife and murmured in surprise as the girl looked utterly exhausted. He asked gently if she was alone, if her parents were nearby, and she only shook her head in silence. Rita's worry spiked. A girl that young, wandering alone in the wilderness, couldn't be taken lightly. There had to be more to her story, so he asked softly if she was hungry and invited her to eat with him. But she gave no verbal response. So he awkwardly coaxed her, saying it was cold where she stood and he wouldn't mind the company, his voice soft and trying to make her feel safe, even as his loneliness slipped through his words, and her stomach growled again. She inched closer to him, step by slow step. She attacked her food ravenously and without hesitation, while Rita watched quietly. She must have been starving, her stomach rumbling once more. He urged her to eat more meat, assuring her there was plenty left, and the girl looked up at him with astonishment shining in her eyes. At last they finished eating. The girl bowed her head slightly and thanked him for the meal. Rita returned the thanks warmly. They'd just shared a meal, so he figured he should introduce himself. Rita Dixon, an adventurer of sorts. The girl answered simply, Mina. Rita's voice went soft as she asked if she knew where home was, or if there was anyone she could return to. Mina shook her head without a sound, his worry deepening, and after a pause he asked her to come with him for now. He said he was headed for a town called Amulus, and they'd pass through a smaller town along the way. Mina hesitantly asked if that would be all right, and Rita reassured her that it was. Then he suddenly noticed the way she walked. Her feet looked painfully sore. He asked if she would let him take a look. She hesitated, pointing out that he had no medicine. Rita replied that he didn't need any, then murmured a hushed chant under his breath, invoking his healing skill to soothe the girl's wounds. In an instant, those cruel wounds vanished. Her eyes widened in amazement when she realized the pain was gone. She thanked him, unsure at first how to address him, and Rita smiled, saying that simply calling him Rita was fine. Tears of joy glistening on her cheeks, Mina accepted it and, her voice trembling, thanked him by name. Afterward, Rita made herself a mug of warm honey tea to keep from getting too cold. That night they lay side by side in the little tent, slipping into a calm shared sleep as the hush of dawn crept in. The cartwheels rolled through the forest's hush. Rita and Mina sat side by side, silent as the cart carried them onward. The peaceful hush was broken when Mina, her voice warm, said how relieved and happy she was to have met someone as kind as Rita, and he replied with a smile. The old man driving the cart glanced back and announced that the town was in sight. Morelia, at long last they had arrived. Rita voiced his thanks, and the old man waved it off with a warm shrug, saying he had done it of his own will. As they entered the town, another elderly man came up to them, curiosity plain on his face as he asked what could bring a father and daughter to such a remote place. Rita introduced himself as Rita Dixon and brought Mina into the introductions. Mina greeted him politely, which made the old man chuckle softly and call her a sweet young lady before he introduced himself as Rogi Morelia, the mayor of the small town, and Rita shook his hand and said they'd be staying for a few days. Rogi's gaze stared at Mina's feet and clothes, noting how dirty and worn she looked, and asking if she'd walked through puddles, so he told them to wash up first in the bath at the end, pointed them to a nearby store where a kind woman ran the inn and a grandmother ran the shop so they could buy clothes and shoes for Mina, and Rita voiced his gratitude. Rogi chuckled again, saying the town might not have much, but its people were warm and the food delicious, and he urged them all to just relax. At the end, the doorbell rang and a cheerful woman greeted them in a bright voice, welcoming them to the Sparrow's Wings. Rita asked if they could stay for the night, and the woman glanced at Mina and, with mock urgency, said the girl should take a bath immediately. She darted to a cabinet and told them their room number, 201 on the second floor. She said the price included meals and was 2 silver coins. She pointed to the bath's location, tossed Rita a pair of boots, and told him Mina couldn't go shopping barefoot. She said she'd be taking the boots back later, so they should shop after bathing. Rita thanked her sincerely. The woman winked and told him not to worry. Mina, Sheba polite, also gave her thanks. Rita said they'd head to the bath first, and Mina nodded in agreement. Just before they parted, Rita faltered and asked Mina if she could bathe by herself, then flinched a little but insisted she wasn't a child anymore. In a women's bath, Mina peeled off her clothes and placed them into the basket. She stepped into the bathroom and gasped at the sight. It had been ages since she'd seen anything like it. She began to wash, working shampoo into her hair, scrubbing her body and rinsing clean. After testing the bath water, she stepped in and let herself relax. She sank into thought and murmured to herself, whispering, "Father, daughter," again and again, a puzzled look on her face. Later, Mina slipped back into their room and told Rita she was back, looking uneasy as she apologized and asked if he had waited long. Rita smiled and reassured her it was fine, saying they should go buy clothes and shoes now. The woman from the end flashed a playful thumbs up and urged them to grab some cute clothes for Mina. They meant to look a little confused at the comment, then let a smile slip across their face, gave a quick wave and said they'd be off. At the shop, an old woman greeted them. When Rita said they were looking for clothes and shoes for Mina, the woman's eyes widened at Mina's tattered outfit. "No spare clothes?" she asked, and Rita, cheeks burning, admitted it was true. The old woman told him to wait while she rummaged for something suitable. She came back with a simple one piece of decent fabric and a pair of boots, said they were perfect for short trips, and called Mina to try them on. Mina slipped into the changing room, her heart quickening. As she did, the old woman turned to Rita, voice sharp, and asked if there was a reason behind her visit. Rita explained that he had come to the town to see if Mina might have any connections there. The old woman shook her head, sympathy soft in her eyes. She'd never seen Mina before. In a small town like Morelia, everyone knew one another. Rita murmured in disappointment. Just then, Mina peeked through the curtain and called to him in a soft, gentle voice. She stepped forward, nervous and fidgeting with her fingers as she waited for his reaction, the old woman giving Rita a small, wordless shrug and nudging him to speak. Rita finally told Mina she looked cute, and inside he admitted he'd always known she was adorable, though he hadn't expected it to be like this. The old woman asked if they should go ahead and pick out more clothes for Mina. Mina looked surprised and unsure, so the old woman reminded her that since she was traveling, a single outfit wouldn't be enough, and Rita gently patted Mina's head, urging her to choose the one she liked best. Mina started browsing the racks of hanging clothes. Timidly, she pulled out a piece and asked for their opinion, and the old woman asked if she was sure that was the one she wanted, or if she would like to see others. Mina turned back and kept searching, then finally stepped out in a new outfit and quietly asked how she looked. Rita smiled and said it suited her well, making Mina blush and be at a loss for words while Rita urged her to try more. After a while, the old woman beamed, thanked them for their patronage, and happily offered one of the outfits as a gift. Rita thanked her warmly. As they stepped outside, Rita hurriedly offered to tuck the new clothes into his item box, though he meant to decline. She then nervously called out his name. When Rita asked what was wrong, she smiled warmly and thanked him for buying the clothes, promising to cherish them. Rita smiled back, said, "You're welcome," and suggested they return to the inn for their meal. At the end, Mina and Rita both offered a quiet thanks before they ate. Mina stared in amazement at how delicious the demon pig steak was. A comment said the pig must be a local specialty. He had never tasted anything like it before, and the innkeeper confirmed it was their signature dish. Especially those demon pigs they raised right in their town. She'd said there had been some trouble lately, when suddenly a loud racket burst from outside and Rita snapped to attention, urgently asking what was happening. She whirled at the sound and said she'd go check. He peeked outside and froze, stunned by the sight. They carried in the injured. He gasped in shock as one man shouted for potions from storage while another brought light. Rita looked around, stunned by the number of wounded. Mina, anxious and voice shaking, wondered aloud what had happened. Injured voices groaned in pain. The mayor barked for one man to hang on as he slapped on herbal painkillers. Someone cried out in disbelief. Were any of them really fatally wounded? Rita sprang forward, declaring she was an adventurer who could use healing magic and offering to help. The innkeeper spun around, startled at the sound of Rita's voice. Mina watched, stunned, as Rita begged her to stay at the inn, but Mina shook her head and refused, saying she would go too. Rita locked his gaze and asked to be led to the fatally wounded. The woman pointed the way, and one man lay with a deep wound in his stomach. The old woman said, worried, that without a priest's healing the man wouldn't survive. Rita wouldn't be stopped. She insisted on trying. He laid his hands over the wound and poured his healing magic into it. Mina rushed over with bandages and herbs, breathless as she asked what had happened, and the old woman thanked her with a grateful smile. She explained that a sudden wolf attack had struck their livestock, and the wounded were the ones who'd gone out to hunt the wolves down. One injured man, half laughing through the pain, said that's how they'd ended up like this. Told Rita not to worry about him and to go help the others, and Rita scolded him. If he could talk, he should be saving his strength. He read or worried to himself, every second sharpening the sting as the wound wouldn't close fast enough, and he regretted not learning more advanced healing magic. But then, determined, he vowed to keep going. If one try wasn't enough, he'd cast it again and again. And he did. Gradually the wound began to close, and the man blinked in disbelief as the pain vanished. He removed the bandage to find the injury healed, then cried out in astonishment that he was completely healed. The old woman stared in awe and blurted out whether Rita's magical rivals were priests, and the man thanked Rita with deep, heartfelt gratitude. Rita answered meekly that it was only beginner-level healing magic. He quietly cast Wind Wash to clean his hands, then announced he was ready for the next fatally injured patient. A man rushed to tell him there were 4 more, tears welling in the old woman's eyes as she whispered that Rita might even be able to save her son. Mina beamed and cheered him on, wishing Rita the best, and Rita nodded with quiet resolve, assuring everyone they should leave it to him. Drenched in sweat, Rita announced this would be the last one. Silently, he cast Heal. The injured man moved his newly restored arms, and the light went stunned, then bowed deeply to Rita, pouring out his heartfelt thanks. Rita wiped the sweat from his brow and exhaled. Just then a voice called out his name. Rita sent. The gathered crowd bowed their heads to him, and Rogi Morelia, the town's mayor, stepped forward, voice thick as he said they could never thank him enough for saving their people. But Rita told them to raise their heads, insisting he'd only done what came naturally. Rogi apologized for the trouble they'd caused and offered Rita 500 silver coins as compensation. But Rita waved him off at once. "That's far too much," she cried, and he insisted he'd only been a stand-in for the potions and couldn't accept such a generous reward. Still, Rogi wouldn't relent. He told Rita to stop joking. Tending to so many wounded would normally cost around 2,000 silver coins. Rita's eyes widened in shock. The old woman nearby asked if he was a priest or a healer and couldn't believe he really didn't know how much healers charged at the market. Rita scratched his head sheepishly and admitted he'd never really thought about it, saying wounds heal on their own, while the woman stared at him in amazement and told him very few people can use healing magic. Even a small injury needs costly potions. Rogi added that if a priest could pull someone back from death's door, the fee would be staggering. The old woman said that even if Rita's healing was only beginner-level magic, nobles would move heaven and earth to keep someone like him around. Rita fell silent. Syra's words about knowing his own worth kept echoing in his head, and after thinking it over, Rita suggested counting his stay at the end of the night as his compensation. But Rogi shook his head firmly and said that wouldn't be nearly enough. Mina, silent until now, suddenly suggested offering them free lodging the next time they visited Morelia, and Rogi lit up at the idea and offered a small tweak. Every time Rita and Mina returned to Morelia, their room was always free. Mina beamed with joy and asked Rita if he was pleased, and he gave her a slightly awkward smile before agreeing. Rita told Rogi it would be enough for his payment, and he then asked whether the town's men would soon go out to hunt the demon wolves. Rogi confirmed they had no choice. Left unchecked, the wolves would keep preying on livestock and might even breach the town limits. Rita suddenly asked to join the hot, and Roji stared at him in surprise, asking, "Are you sure?" Rita turned to Mina and said plainly that since they were heading toward Amulus, he didn't want them attacked while it was just the two of them. He admitted his power was small, only a few offensive spells, and he thought he wouldn't slow the others down. Rogi jumped in at once, saying just having someone who could heal would lift their morale and fighting edge, and he promised Rita he'd be a vital asset. Red flashed a smile and said he'd be in their care, and Roger returned that warmth, promising they'd be in his care too. Later that evening, back at the inn, Rita let out a relieved sigh and said he felt refreshed. He praised Mina for her efforts earlier. Mina thanked him. Then after a pause she smiled and called his name, and Rita turned to her with a curious look. A faint blush warming his cheeks, Mina said he'd been really cool. Rita flushed bright red, murmuring a shy thank you as she tried to brush it off. He announced the day was over and flipped off the light. He said goodnight to Mina. She answered with a soft goodnight. Morning broke, and a group of men gathered outside, bracing themselves for the day's work. Rita came forward and greeted them with a bright, "Good morning, everyone!" And the men answered back with eager cheers. One man asked Rita to give the orders, so she straightened up and declared they were heading out to hunt demon wolves, and the men all shouted their agreement in one loud, united yes. Demon wolves closed in around the wagons, forcing everyone to raise their weapons, and formed tight defensive lines as one of the beasts fixed them with a fierce, menacing glare. And amid the taut silence, a woman told Dick that her right leg had been injured. Dick, stunned by the revelation, burned with worry and anger at demon wolves so close to town and cried out for everyone to rally and protect their employer and the wagons. As pain surged through her, injured Faifa grimaced as a man in the group pointed out that the wolf's fur was so thick even arrows couldn't pierce it, and Dick, clearly agitated, muttered anxiously that things were only getting worse. He turned to Fafa, his voice urgent. Could she still use magic? She, wounded, said she could keep going, and Fafa began to cast silently in her mind, calling on the spirit of fire to turn the enemy to ash. A fireball was called forth and slammed into one of the wolves, leaving only a small burn and singed fur. She knew the spell wasn't strong enough and cast it again. One strike wouldn't do. As she poured herself into the spell, a wolf slipped past Dick and lunged at her with its jaws wide open, terror seizing her and tears welling in her eyes. At that critical moment, Rita hurled herself into the charging wolf, pushing it away from Fifa. The beast tumbled to the ground. A man seized the chance and drove his sword into the wolf, piercing it, while the men, fired up by the moment, cried out to follow Rita as Commander Riggs shouted the order to counterattack. They answered with a spirited, "Yes, sir." Rita warned the commander not to overextend himself, explaining that while wounds could be healed, lost blood and physical strength wouldn't return so easily. She then approached Faifa, asked for permission, and checked her injury, suspecting broken bones, and Faifa gazed at him through the haze of pain and sweat. When Rita touched her wound, a sharp cry tore from her. He cast heal silently in his mind. Curious, Rita asked if they were adventurers, and an older man suddenly blurted out that he'd recognized Commander Riggs. Surprised, the commander turned to him, Eric, who confirmed it and said the group was escorting a peddler from the capital. Rita finished the healing. The wound vanished completely, and Faithful stood frozen, stunned by the sudden recovery. Dick asked whether Rita and his group intended to assist, and Rita healed him, saying they had come specifically to hunt the demon wolves. Eric hurriedly offered to pay for the treatment, but the treated refused, insisting it was free of charge. Dick thanked them and said he and Fifa would take the left side of the carriage, leaving the right to the townspeople. Everyone shouted as one and charged the wolves. The men shouted orders to each other as Commander Riggs barked for them to isolate the wolves and pick them off one by one. Later, the commander sat beside Rita and said that at this rate they'd soon completely subdue the demon wolves, while Rita quietly healed a man's injured leg. Suddenly he yelled at him to stop and his tone froze the others. Something was approaching. A colossal demon wolf loomed into view. The men fell silent, words choked off, their bodies went rigid with shock. Rita cried out in disbelief, asking what they were looking at, and Commander Riggs echoed his astonishment. It was enormous, almost certainly the leader. The enormous beast whipped its tail, flinging men through the air as if they weighed nothing until only Rita and Commander Riggs were left standing, and the massive wolf glared at them. Riggs felt uneasy, as if it were staring right at them. He read the confirmation and thought so too. The beast let out an ear-splitting roar and barreled forward. Sending more men flying would be going way too far. The commander, unnerved, shouted that it was upon them, though unsure of his own strength, and vowed to protect Rita. Rita, resolute, declared he would strike back. He closed his eyes and silently called on the spirit of fire. The chant echoed in his mind, and a barrage of fireballs materialized, stunning the commander as they launched toward the monstrous foe. Rita hurled a flurry of fireballs that slammed into the massive demon wolf from every side. The beast skidded to a halt, stunned for a heartbeat. Without pause, Rita swiftly chanted a new incantation in his mind, summoning a searing spear of fire that erupted from the ground beneath the wolf and pierced clean through its body. More fiery spears erupted, stabbing into the creature again and again. Just as quickly as they had appeared, the lances of fire vanished, leaving gaping, charred wounds. Blood sprayed from the beast's pierced body, and with one final breath it collapsed, dead. When the fight was over, Rita dismissed his magic book. The men stared in awe at the follow monster, disbelief and astonishment rippling through the group at the nature of the spell and its overwhelming power. The commander couldn't hide his awe at Rita's magic. Rita, blushing and shy, admitted that while he might still be ranked F, he was, after all, a mage. Dick flinched and snapped at the others not to lose focus as the last wolves fled. Faithful brimming with resolve and ready to give chase, and Rita offered to help, asking someone to watch the wagon in his absence. Meanwhile, back at the inn, Mina's voice shook with worry over Rita's long absence, and an elderly woman tried to soothe her, confident that her father would return safely, when a voice suddenly called out excitedly that the others had returned. Mina froze, stunned, then bolted outside. From a distance she saw Rita, her eyes wide with feeling. He smiled at his companions, and Mina, relief washing over her, smiled too. Noticing her, Rita wove his way through the crowd. I met him halfway and pulled him into a warm embrace. That night, a celebratory feast filled the air as townspeople danced joyfully around a roaring bonfire, a party to mark the subjugation of the demon wolves. And Rita, drink in hand, beamed about a job well done, and how glad he was to see Mina enjoying herself. Roger Morelia stepped up to Rita and asked if he was having fun, and Rita smiled and said, "Yes." The mayor took a seat beside him and brought up Rita's plan to torture the amulet the following day. And just then Eric called out to Morelia and Rita. Morelia greeted Eric, saying he'd arrived at the perfect moment. Eric apologized, admitting he should have introduced himself earlier. He was Eric Latcher, from the Latcher Corporation. In return, Rita gave his name. Eric thanked Rita for his help. He explained that thanks to him, all of his escorts were safe, and even the transported goods were untouched, so now he could proceed to the amulets without concern. Eric said he'd heard from Morelia that Rita was planning to travel to Amulus with his daughter and would propose they travel together. Rita, a bit surprised, asked if that was really acceptable, and before he could get an answer, a voice called out to him again. There she was, Mina, inviting him to dance. Rita wavered, insisting he couldn't dance, but the older woman gently pushed him toward Mina and urged him to just enjoy it. Eric, preparing to leave, said they'd see each other tomorrow, and Rita nodded and replied. He turned to face Mina, who stood there smiling at him. He couldn't help thinking how long it had been since he'd last danced. Mina swayed to the beat with confident ease, laughing as she guided his unsure steps. He fumbled to keep up when a memory of dancing once with someone named Rincer bubbled up, and a man nearby shouted in jest, teasing Rita about the gloomy look on the town hero's face. So Rita flushed bright red, horribly embarrassed, and tried to stop the teasing. Mina laughed, and Rita glanced at her puzzled face. Inwardly, he grew thoughtful. He had things to consider. He wondered if it would truly be right to bring her with him. After all, in Morelia no one knew her. His journey would end in amulets. Mina noticed and remarked on how red his face was. Rita couldn't shake the thought that even in Amulus there was no promise they'd find someone who knew her. So maybe this town, where she had finally opened up, was the place for her. And then he suddenly called out to Mina. She turned, curious, and he told her he would be leaving for Amulus the next day. She lit up and replied with bright excitement, clearly looking forward to it. Rita blinked in surprise. Her reaction caught him off guard. A soft, quiet smile spread across his face. He warned her they'd have a tough day ahead, so they should rest once the festivities ended. She agreed. Morning came, and the townspeople gathered to see them off. Rita voiced his gratitude to Eric. Eric replied that they must support one another. A woman handed me the cookies they'd baked, and an old lady gently patted her head, urging her to eat them properly. Mina thanked them sincerely. The commander waved Rita goodbye and asked him to come back sometime. Roji Morelli chuckled warmly, assuring him he'd always be welcome. Eric, seeing the farewells done, beckoned Rita onto the wagon. Rita nodded and climbed in, and as the wagon rolled forward, the townspeople stood watching, shouting Rita's name and asking him to visit again, and promising she'd wait for his return. The wagon slowly left the town behind. Inside, Dick's side reflected on their inability to do anything against the demon wolves. He said they still had a long way to go, and Faye, for one, agreed. Dick, still dazed by Rita's power, couldn't wrap his head around how someone with such miraculous healing magic could be stuck at F rank. Fafa pointed out her offensive spells were just as insane. Blushing, Dick admitted that he and Fafa were F rank too, and he wasn't even sure they'd ever climb out of it. Rita reassured him. He said that Dick was still young and had real potential. Keep at it, and C, maybe even B, wasn't impossible. Encouraged, Dick smiled, relief washing over him at the news, when suddenly one of the men called out a warning that the path ahead might be rough, and Dick, feeling duty tug at his sleeve, nodded, turned to Faifa, and the two stepped out of the wagon to get back to work. Eric told Rita, bright with hope, that at their current pace, they'd reach their destination before evening. Rita gasped in surprise. She'd been told it would take 2 days. Eric said the estimate only covered the old mountain route. Since then, they'd built a new bridge that opened a faster, more direct path, and the new road was much more efficient. Reading from the side, they were impressed and remarked on the remarkable development of Amulets. Their trip carried on smoothly as Mina and Rita happily munched the cookies she'd been given. Then, without warning, the wagon jerked to a halt. Rita looked up and saw a wall far off. Realization hit her. It was a town, and Mina asked, "Is it an amulet?" Rita noticed the construction. Lots of workers shoring up the half-finished outer wall. And Eric said that since the town was still being built, there weren't many buildings yet, but it already hummed with energy. Rita agreed, saying that even if being an adventurer didn't work out, a town like this would have plenty of other jobs waiting. Eric announced they'd finally reached the town, saying if anything went wrong, they could lean on the Lashore Corporation. He vowed to repay his debt, and the others stared at him, puzzled by the sudden mention of a favor. Eric made it clear. It was about the demon wolves, and thanks to Rita, he could carry on his business without a hint of fear. Rita matched the kindness, heartfelt and grateful to Eric for letting him ride around town. Should Eric ever need help, Rita vowed he'd return the favor. Then Rita suddenly noticed. Mina had been quiet for a while. He turned and found her sleeping peacefully beside him. Eric laughed, saying their conversation must be over. At last they arrived. Eric announced they'd head for the Merchant's Gate. Dick called out to Rita, promising they'd meet again and go on a quest together when they had the chance. Faith of bid Mina a fond farewell. Rita thanked them both for everything and bade them goodbye. He turned to Mina and said it was time to enter Amulus. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and nodded, and Rita gently took her hand as they walked together through the gates of the growing town. In the lively, bustling town of Amulus, Rita and Mina walked side by side, Rita reading the letter Sira had given him. Before long, they arrived at the Amulet branch of the Adventurers Guild, and when they stepped inside Malay, the receptionist greeted them with a warm smile and asked what had brought them here. Reed said he planned to move here and register with a guild in this town. Malay acknowledged the request with a quick nod and beckoned them forward. She slid a form across to Rita and asked him to fill it out. As he went through the paperwork, he mumbled that he needed to write their names. He wrote down Rita Dixon and hesitated for a moment before carrying on. After finishing the form, Mina glanced down and froze in surprise. Mina Dixon was written beside his name. Rita apologized for writing it without asking and asked if it bothered her. Mina shook her head and replied with quiet gratitude. He thought of Rita and told himself that if they ever met someone who turned out to be a blood relative of hers, he'd explain the situation then. Rita then mentioned he had something else, handed over a letter and said it was a letter of introduction from the Capitals Guild, and Malay took the letter. She read it and gasped in surprise. It wasn't just an introduction, it was a letter of recommendation, from Sira herself. Mina asked if that was a bad thing, but Malay assured her it was exactly the opposite. Glancing at the letter, she asked Rita if he really could use healing magic, and Rita confirmed it, though he admitted he could only use heal. When Malay told him there was also a healer's guild, Rita just said he'd always worked as an adventurer. Malay pointed out that even beginner-level healing magic was hugely valuable, then asked if he could start taking requests as early as tomorrow, which left Rita completely stunned. They hadn't even secured a place to stay for the night yet, but Malay assured him the guild wasn't affiliated with anyone, so he could go too. She leaned in and added that not only would the guild cover the cost, but he would also have free access to their collection of magic books. Rita, cheeks flushed and a little flustered, thanked her. Malay smiled and asked once more if he would be accepting requests. Rita nodded in agreement, though he warned that his healing could only cover a few potions. Malay waved it off, saying it was no problem, and thanked him. Rita modestly replied that it was nothing. Then Malay handed him another letter, this one an introduction to the inn, and Rita thanked her again. Later that night they reached the inn, where an older dwarf let out a booming laugh and declared that Rita had finally arrived. He introduced himself as Riggs Doran, the owner of the inn called the Bearded Dwarf, and beside him stood a cheerful dwarf girl named Mirren, who greeted them warmly. Rita introduced herself as Rita Dixon, and Mina gave her name too. Rita said Mina was a little shy, and asked Mirren to look after her, so Mirren beamed, hugged Mina, and happily said that since Mina was going to live in town, they should get along, and Mina agreed. Riggs grinned, saying his daughter seemed to have taken to Rita's girl and was absolutely thrilled. Rita hesitated, then gently corrected him. Mina wasn't actually his daughter, and Riggs only gave a small, surprised smile. He noted that, as an adventurer, Rita probably had her share of messy problems, and he added that he didn't bother with the details. As long as Rita was taking care of her, that was all that mattered. Riggs mentioned Rita's room was ready and unchanged. Rita said it was no problem and they'd be in Riggs' care from now on, and Riggs agreed. If they'd all be living under the same roof, he'd treat them like family. He called Mirren over, asked her to show them to their room and where the toilet and bath were, ruffled her hair and told her to eat with them afterward, and Mirren smiled and agreed. Suddenly she grabbed Mina's hand with a sunny laugh and pulled her along, leaving Mina a bit startled as she called after her. A short while later, Mirren burst back in, shouting with excitement about the food, the pull-off, the salad, and a soup filled with plenty of meat. She placed the dishes on the table, sat down next to Mina, and together they began their meal. Mina scooped up a spoonful of soup and lifted it to her mouth, and flared into light, as Mir and Chuckle beamed with pride and praised her father's cooking. While Myrna recognized the meat as the demon pig from Morelia, he smiled. The heat was just right and the aroma lovely, and the faint salt of the pilaf washed the weariness of their journey away. I read some complimented Riggs and realized that when people hear dwarves, they instantly picture blacksmiths. So imagining them cooking too was a wild surprise. Mirren said her father used to forge swords, but after she was born he gave up the forge and became a cook. Rita told Mirren that her father was amazing, and Mirren beamed with pride, saying she already knew. After the meal, they went back to their room. Rita said Mirren was a good kid. Mina smiled and said she had already become friends with her, and Rita brightened at that, glad since they'd be staying there for a while. Suddenly, a knock sounded at the door. Rita answered, and Mirren swung it wide with a bright smile, cheerfully inviting Mina to come take a bath with them. Mina and Moran entered the bathroom together, and Mina tenderly washed Moran's hair. While they soaked in the bath, Mina realized Mirren didn't have a mother, and Mirren cheerfully said she loved running the inn with her dad every day. Though sometimes strange, even troublesome guests came by. She leapt from the water and, bursting with pride, declared that in those moments her father lit up with energy. She told Mina her dad was kind of cool, and Mina, talking about Rita and even calling him her dad, paused and agreed that he was kind and a good person, while Mirren burst out excitedly that if their dads could become friends and take a bath together like they were doing, it would be wonderful. Meanwhile, Rita, overhearing them from outside, let out an awkward little murmur, acknowledging the remark but clearly flustered. The next day, Rita healed the man's wrist with a calm, sure touch. Text, an adventurer from Amulus, stood wide-eyed, unable to look away. He couldn't help but point out that Rita had even healed 3 others who'd been badly hurt. He frowned, incredulous, asking what kind of person would bring a child while escorting lumberjacks. Rita chuckled softly and said they'd only arrived the day before, so he couldn't leave her alone. Text smiled and praised Rita, telling Mina she had a good father. Mina thanked him politely. Text pretended to cry, joking she should call him Aichan instead of uncle, since he was only 40. The man behind him said 40 was already pretty old. Another chimed in that he was more like a grandpa, and an annoyed Text dared them to fight. He grabbed Rita and asked Mina if Rita was an uncle to her too. Mina froze, lost in thought. He smiled and replied that Rita wasn't an uncle. He was simply Rita. Rita, feeling awkward, laughed and thanked her. Later, they came upon some very tall trees, and Rita, surprised, asked about them. Text handed the situation to Rita. Confused, Rita asked for clarification on what exactly he was supposed to do, and he scratched his head and casually said he assumed a mage could do something about it. Rita pointed to the trees and asked if he was supposed to bring him down. He immediately said he couldn't, then fell quiet to think. Rita finally said he'd give it a try. Tex encouraged him, saying if he had any ideas he should go ahead. Rita nodded and warned everyone not to get in front of him. Silently, Rita plants a whisper of magic in his mind, summoning the spirit of the wind. A fierce gust of wind twisted into a massive blade, sweeping across and slicing through the towering trees, sending many of them crashing to the ground. Rita said it was too powerful. Behind him, the adventurers stood frozen in stunned silence, their jaws dropping in shock, while Mina, full of awe, softly whispered how amazing Rita was. Tex, shouting in astonishment, cried out that he'd asked Rita to handle it, but he'd never expected such an overwhelming result. One of the men stared in shock. Could that really have been a windblade? Another muttered that windblade was supposed to be beginner-level magic, while the texts playfully slapped Rita's chest and teased that what she'd done wasn't what a normal windblade looked like. A nearby man joked that with Rita around they'd all lose their jobs, and another, half serious, said she should think about becoming a lumberjack. Rita, slightly embarrassed, admitted he had just been feeling good lately. Text pointed out that magical power is supposed to correspond with how much mana someone has, then asked what exactly was going on with Rita's magic power. Brushing it off, he said they'd leave that aside for now. The real issue was what to do with all the fell trees. There were too many for the wagon to carry, and Tex noted that since they still had plenty of time, maybe they could carry them one at a time, but there were around 30 trees in total. Rita silently cast a restraining spell into his mind. He spoke the words aloud, "Chain bind," and in an instant countless chains sprang up, coiling tight around the large tree trunks. Rita winked and revealed that he actually had an item box. He activated it, and the cut trees were sucked in one by one, not a single one left behind. The group of men behind him stood dumbfounded, jaws dropping in utter disbelief, as a stunned Tex muttered that Rita could seemingly do anything. The other men swarmed around him, admiration shining in their eyes, and Mina, watching from the back, quietly thought that Rita really was a good person. She remembered the first time she met him, how cautious and scared she had been. Sure, he might be dangerous, until she realized he wasn't at all. He took care of her, someone who couldn't remember anything except her name. He was always there for her, kind and steady, nothing like the other healers she had known. And just then a text made an announcement, earlier than expected, saying they would return it down. So he told everyone to load the remaining materials and prepare the wagon as they got ready to head back, while Minus's thoughts drifted to the healer she once met. Most people only talked about money, but Rita was different. He always put the person he was healing first. He turned to Mina and said he'd go help with the preparations so she should wait a bit, and when Mina smiled and agreed, she felt truly happy to have met someone so kind. She knew he'd been asking Malay and Riggs about her family. Mina looked up at the sky. The moon shone high above. She whispered the word family so quietly it barely left her lips, and she wondered what would happen when he learned the truth. Maybe you'd stop smiling. Maybe you'd come to hate her. Maybe you'd go far away. She didn't want that. Rita called to her, her voice urgent. It was time to go back. Mina answered with agreement and promised they'd return. Then, barely whispering to herself, she admitted she wanted to stay with Rita forever. Back in town, a mysterious figure watched them from up high. Rita and Mina walked side by side, completely unaware they were being watched. The figure's dark eyes fixed on them, following every twitch and step. Mina laughed softly, clinging to Rita with quiet affection. Then, without a sound, the figure slipped into the shadows. In the forest, the beasts felled by the adventurers lay lifeless across the ground, and Rita quietly tended to a wounded man, healing his injuries. The man thanked Rita, saying she had saved them. He'd heard from his younger sister that Rita's healing magic was remarkable. He'd been on the verge of death, and Rita wondered who his sister was. The man pointed at his eyes like a clue. Malay instantly stepped in to read his mind, and realization hit him. Malay Sand? He then asked if the man was Iron, and Iron just smiled and gave a thumbs up. Iron muttered, frustration thick in his voice. This whole situation was a real headache. He hadn't expected monsters this huge to show up here. Rita was stunned. After all, this place was only an hour from town. Iron explained that, up until now, he'd only ever seen small monsters in this area. Suddenly, Mina blurted out that demon wolves had started appearing in Morelia too. She clenched her hands, worry knotting in her chest. Iron fell silent, paused, then suggested perhaps it was the result of a turf war or some territorial conflict. Rita brushed that aside and asked what Iron planned to do next. Iron said they'd sort the cargo and fix the carriage so they'd camp there for the night before heading to Amulus. Rita said they'd head back while there was still daylight, and Iron's smile tightened into a knot. Rita and Mina waved their goodbyes as they walked back slowly. He yawned in mid-step, and Mina, clearly worried, asked if he was okay. Was he sleepy? She pointed out that the night before, even before she fell asleep, he'd been bent over a guild book studying magic, and Rita just brushed it off. He was fine, had gone to sleep before it got too late, and he'd even thanked her for worrying about him. Right then, a loud noise ripped through the forest's hush. Rita looked up in alarm. Mina asked, concerned, if the sound came from deeper inside the forest. She quickly pointed to a nearby path and told them to go check it. If it looked dangerous, they could turn back, and Rita agreed. They followed the path, and as they moved, Rita suddenly spotted something. Dead bees lay scattered on the ground. He looked at them uneasily. He spotted someone and called out to check if he was all right. The stranger looked like an adventurer from Amulus, but when the man turned, Rita froze. He was an elf, and she asked in surprise why elves would be so close to a human village, while the elf immediately warned him not to come any closer. Rita held his hands up in a calming gesture, saying he meant no harm. He told himself he understood El had a deep-seated hatred of humans, but even so, this went too far. Suddenly, he spotted something that made him gasp. A child. Rita's concern spiked. He asked, voice tight, what had happened to the child, who was groaning softly in pain. The elf man snapped back that this was their own problem to deal with, and that they would handle it themselves. Mina, panic in her voice, pointed out that the child was clearly suffering. Rita urged that he could use healing magic. The elf man refused flatly, saying he couldn't possibly trust a human. Rita begged him to trust him, at least enough to let him examine the child. The elf woman stepped forward and said the child had been poisoned by a ruby tiger, and that healing magic alone wouldn't be enough. Rita shouted that he could use antidote magic, and the elf woman turned toward him in shock. Her voice torn with desperation, she begged Rita to help her son. The elven man called out her name. Edith. She cried back, calling him Claus and saying that at this rate their child would die. That's why she had to ask. Rita barreled past them, claws raised and his bow at the ready, shouting at him. But Mina lunged forward and threw her body in front of Rita to shield him. She shouted that if Rita made any suspicious move, Klaus could shoot her instead. That would make them even, right? Klaus gasped in disbelief. Rita thanked Mina and said he would begin. In his mind, Rita was grateful he had learned the antidote spell from the guild's magic books. He vowed again to make learning every healing and treatment spell his highest priority. Rita cast the healing spell. The elf child was drenched in sweat and writhing in pain. Edith murmured in relief as the child's face slowly began to relax. Claus watched, whispering the child's name. Kate Mina. And when Kate Mina saw the improvement, relief washed over her. Claus then bowed deeply to Rita, apologizing and thanking him from the bottom of his heart for saving his son. Klaus swallowed and admitted they had no money for the treatment. And Rita smiled warmly, brushing it off and telling him not to worry. He was just an adventurer who happened to be able to use healing magic. Reed said that if they truly wanted to repay him, they only had to report to the Adventure Guild and Amulet that the quest had been completed. As for the request fee, he slid a paper across with all the information. Klaus read it and stared in surprise. The amount was listed in silver coins. Edith pointed out it was even cheaper than the potion they'd bought before, and Mina explained that monsters had been growing in number lately, so potion prices were bound to rise. Rita asked about the potion, wondering why they'd come to a human town on purpose, and he said the elves were supposed to have an elixir passed down through their generations, that he'd heard was much more effective than normal potions. Klaus answered that their elixir had run out, and Rita asked, alarmed, what had happened. Klaus said a black dragon had appeared near their village and attacked without warning, and Edith added that the village warriors had fought back and somehow driven it off. But the cost was terrible. The elixir stores were gone, and many warriors were still suffering from wounds from the attack. Klaus warned that in their current state, if the village were attacked again, they'd have no choice but to abandon it. Mina called out to Rita, smiling gently as he patted her head, and Rita then asked Klaus if he would be willing to take him to their village, to which Klaus said his healing magic would surely be useful to them. Edith looked at Klaus and softly called him dear, and Klaus replied that he would trust Rita. He hesitated for a moment, uncertain of how to address him. Then Rita introduced himself, and Klaus said he would do his best to persuade everyone in the village, and earnestly asked Rita to save their warriors. Later that night, Kate, still unconscious, kept slipping in and out of awareness. He felt himself trembling and told himself he must be inside a carriage. There was no pain left in his body, so he figured he might already be dead. He opened his eyes slowly. Mina leaned over, voice soft. "Are you okay?" Kate blinked, confused, and stared at her. Mina asked again, worry written all over her face. "Does it still hurt? Are you feeling all right?" Kate looked at her in surprise and answered. Mina broke into a wide, relieved smile and said she was glad. Feeling overwhelmed, Kate thought to himself, scrabbling to make sense of it all. What was going on? He had come with his father and mother, their hands clamped over their ears as they carried potions into the human town. Then a ruby tiger lunged at them, and in that heartbeat he was caught. He met an angel. An old man stood nearby, but it didn't matter to him. Mina pressed a cool, damp cloth to his forehead. Kate suddenly sat up and Mina flinched in surprise. Kate blushed and awkwardly introduced himself, thanking her for taking care of him. Mina gave her name in return and suggested they get along. Kate asked where Mina came from. When she told him Amulus, he cried out in excitement that he'd been there that very day. Mina shifted awkwardly and said she understood. Kate burst into non-stop chatter. He said his father was better with a sword than a bow, and that his mother was good at cooking and working with medicinal herbs. As the journey continued, Rita watched in awe as the trees parted like curtains, opening a clear path for the carriage. Mina added that once the carriage passed through, the trees would slide back and close the path behind them. The wagon jolted to a sudden stop. Mina spun around, eyes wide and confused, asked if it had stopped. Kate said it didn't stop like normal. There was something only someone else could use. Ancient teleportation magic flared up, and in the next instant they all vanished without a trace. They appeared out of nowhere in the village. Rita glanced around and whispered, "This is the place." Edith confirmed it. It was the elves' village, and Mina, standing beside them, murmured with concern. They had finally arrived at the entrance. Claus turned to Rita and asked if he could heal the warriors right away. Rita answered, "Of course. That's why you came." A nearby elf saw Claus returning and called out, acknowledging him. But another elf, eyes wide, cried out in alarm that a human was with him. Angrily, one of the elves snapped, demanding an explanation from Claus. Guards closed in on them in an instant, and one of the elves shouted, demanding to know by whose permission Claus had brought a human into their village. Claus called for everyone to listen, and explained that Rita could use healing magic, and that he had saved Kate's life after the boy had been attacked by a monster. The elf scoffed, questioning whether Rita was really a healer and sneering that all human healers only cared about money. Mina defended Rita, insisting he was different, and Kate shouted out too, declaring that Mina Chan's father wasn't like that. A hush fell as an elderly elf suddenly arrived, demanding to know what all the commotion was about. He turned with urgent words, the village elder, and then Etta stepped forward, pledging that her family would take responsibility and begging that Rita be allowed to treat the warriors. Rita calmly addressed the elder, introduced himself as Rita Dixon, a simple adventurer with healing magic, explained his power was at least as strong as a high potion, and asked them to treat the injured immediately. The elder felt the cruel irony of a human healer coming to their village at such a time. He eyed Rita with suspicion, and Rita, slightly tense, met his stare. After a pause, the elder suddenly smiled and said, "Maybe it was time for things to change." He nodded and gave his permission, pointed the way, and asked Rita Dixon to save their warriors, while the guards behind them cried out in disbelief, stunned by the elder's decision. They stepped into this building. Rita looked around, surprise written on her face. The room was filled with wounded people. The elder said that, thanks to Hildegarda, no one had died. They were lucky. Mina asked with curious eyes about the name Hildegarda, and the elder explained that Hildegarda was the village's strongest warrior. She didn't need a bow, for her magic was incredible. As the battle raged, everyone fought under Hildegard's command. In the end, she took the dragon's breath full on to protect everyone. And the elders said that, with the proud heart of a warrior, Hildegarda refused any elixirs or potions for herself, insisting they be used on others instead. Rita said she was truly amazing. The elder replied that her wounds were grave, the situation dire. Even if her injuries couldn't be healed entirely, even easing the pain would be something. And he trailed off. Rita said he would do everything he could. The elder told him the room was just beyond the curtain. Then, lifting his voice a little, he announced they were entering. Rita and Mina crept forward and stepped inside as an elf woman spun to face them. On the bed lay a girl, her body wrapped head to toe in bandages. Rita stared at her, eyes wide with shock. He whispered to himself, eyes wide with awe, that this girl was Hildegarda, the village's strongest warrior. Hildegarda slowly opened her eyes and fixed her gaze on them. She began to sit up, calling for the elder. The elder immediately told her not to get up. Hildegarda fixed Rita and Mina with a sharp stare and asked, "Why is a human here?" She fixed them with a steady, unblinking stare. Hildegarda's eyes flashed as she demanded why a human was here. The elder answered calmly that he had brought him. He could use healing magic. Rita introduced himself as Rita Dixon and said he would begin healing now. He edged toward her, shaken, seized a guard and shouted for him not to touch her. Then Rita gently pushed her back onto the bed and she cried out in pain. Rita quietly slipped a healing spell into his mind, while Hildegarda, teeth clenched, spat a curse at him, aching to move and vowing he'd hear every one of her complaints later. She kept shouting, demanding he let go of her. Rita shouted back, warning her not to move or her wounds would reopen. Hildegarda, furious, yelled again. Where exactly did he think he was touching? And Rita replied that healing required physical contact. She kept resisting, her voice fierce as she demanded how long he planned to keep his hands on her. Out of nowhere, she kicked Rita, knocking him away. He let out a raw cry of pain. "He'll have the guard set up." Slowly, the bandages wrapped around her body came undone and fell onto the bed. The other girls in the room gasped. Her wounds had vanished. Hildegarda looked down at her arms in disbelief. The severe burns had completely disappeared. Stunned, she turned to Rita and spoke his name like a question, then suddenly grabbed the front of his clothes and cried about how terrible her wounds were. Her flesh had melted away, her bones were exposed, and seeing it healed so easily, she demanded to know who he really was. Rita, flustered, told her to wait and pleaded, "Please cover your body first." Hildegarda's face turned bright crimson, and the whole room fell silent as she shoved the elder and Rita out, yelling for every man to leave at once. Outside the room, Rita stepped out and saw they'd been kicked out. The elder chuckled, apologized, then grew serious and respectfully thanked the man who had healed her, and Rita smiled, saying he was simply relieved she was all right. With a flicker of mana still left, he offered to keep healing the wounded. The elder accepted with a grateful nod, and Rita set to work, tending the remaining wounded one by one. He moved between them, with Mina never leaving his side, and Edith and Kate pitched in too. Mina and Kate soaked towels in water and laid them on the patient to cool him down. The elder watched in wonder and murmured, "So everyone's healed now." Rita confirmed. There were 50 of them in all. The elder laughed. That must have been exhausting. Rita, still smiling, said he'd been feeling good lately. He could feel his mana surge, like a lid inside him finally snapping free. Claus hurried over to the elder and reported that all the potions have been safely stored in the warehouse, and the elder smiled warmly, commending him for a job well done. Claus turned to Rita and, relief warming his voice, thanked him. Thanks to Rita's help, the potions were fully secured, and Rita responded, glad to hear it. The elder cut in, saying it was time for Rita to rest. He asked Claus to guide her, and Claus agreed. Edith stepped in and offered their home, suggesting Rita stay there for the night. Luckily, their house hadn't been burned down. Rita accepted with a warm, grateful smile and thanked her. He said they would stay the night. Mina turned to Kate and urged them to get along. Kate blushed, stammering as he agreed. Later that night, Rita and Mina fell sound asleep. Morning broke over the Elven village. At the village headquarters, Rita announced his arrival and walked into the room with Mina. Hildegarda sat on her bed and quietly acknowledged him. She said their names, Rita and Mina, and sat up straight. Mina beamed at her with a cheerful smile, saying her skin looked even more beautiful, and Hildegarda replied with a brief, grateful thanks. Turning to Rita, Hildegarda apologized for kicking him the day before, and began to explain that elves disliked humans, but Rita cut her off, begging to at least tell him why, and Hildegarda agreed. She explained that, though it had died down recently, there used to be people who kidnapped and trafficked elves, and that was the beginning. Because they lived for ages, elves were forced into backbreaking work and kept as slaves. Some languish in the basements of wealthy human mansions, tortured out of sight. BLs launched rescue raids time and again to free them, but not everyone made it back. Some never returned at all, and that was the reason humans were so deeply resented. Over time, the elves had begun to put distance between themselves and humans, and Rita responded with quiet understanding, acknowledging the painful history that had led to that divide. Hildegarda noticed that even so, some elves had still chosen to leave the village and live among humans. She pushed that thought aside, came back to the moment, and, with all her sincerity, bowed her head to Rita, thanking him deeply for healing the village warriors, her gratitude coming from the very bottom of her heart. Rita modestly replied that he'd only done what he could, and there was no need to thank him. Mina pouted and told him she was thanking him anyway. Rita scratched his head, let out a small sigh, gave in, and accepted the gratitude. Hildegarda nodded firmly. That was the proper response. Hildegarda turned to Mina and said she'd heard Mina had worked hard alongside Kate, then reached out and pulled her close, saying she'd give her a hug and thank her. Mina mumbled in surprise, overwhelmed, and Hildegarda smiled warmly as she embraced her. She said that, even though she disliked humans, she'd make an exception for the two of them. They could call her Hilda, and Mina looked up and echoed the name in wide-eyed wonder. Hilda gushed, declaring her unbelievably cute and hugging her tighter. Then let Mina call her Oni-chan, and Mina gratefully answered Hilda Oni-chan, as a gentle smile lingered at the side, watching how well the two got along. Hildegarda suddenly flinched as a sharp thought hit her. Had Rita assumed she was Mina's age? Rita looked confused, and Hildegarda went on, saying she could understand him treating her like a child. She still wouldn't accept it. Even though her growth had been slow, she firmly declared her age. 316 years. And Mina gasped in astonishment, crying out how amazing it was while Hildegarda chuckled and told Mina to show more respect. Though by Elven standards she was still considered young, she added that their village elder was 1,000 years old, and she'd even heard the elder in the next village, about a month's journey away, was 2,000 years old. Rita's jaw dropped in shock while Mina quietly mouthed her awe. Suddenly, Hildegarda's ears twitched. Mina noticed and asked what was wrong. Rita asked too, wondering if someone was running, and Hildegarda muttered that she hoped it wasn't bad news. At that moment, Claus burst into the room, apologizing for barging in and shouting that it had arrived, while Hildegard's face went hard and she asked, "Is it the Black Dragon?" With sharp authority, she barked the order to prepare. Claw gave a quick nod and slipped away to get ready, and Hildegard turned to Rita and Mina, thanked them for everything they'd done, and quietly told them she had a fight now. Worried, Rita stepped forward and reminded her that even if she was healed, her injuries had been bad. Was she really planning to fight again? Hildegarda only grinned, gave Rita a light punch, and affirmed it. She was the village's strongest warrior, and if she didn't fight, who would? Rita watched her in silence for a heartbeat, then spoke with quiet resolve. He would go too. Someone gasped and called his name. Rita said that even if he could only help with healing magic, his power would still support them, and Mina stepped away from the agreement, saying they'd go together. Rita spun to her and vowed he'd come back safe. She had to stay behind. Mina nodded, telling him he must. Outside, the warriors gathered at the village center, the air thick with tension, and not a word was spoken until Hildegarda raised her voice to address the brave elves. Their enemy was the Black Dragon, the creature that had destroyed their village and hurt their loved ones. She acknowledged their fear. She felt it too. But if they fled, who would protect their home and the people they cared about? She commanded them to pour every last shred of pride into their arrows and bring the beast down. The warriors roared in unison, their spirit rekindled, and she declared that this time they would not lose. Victory would be theirs. So with loud cheers, the warriors raised their bows. Then Hildegarda let out a sharp cry, announcing the dragon's arrival. She snapped orders, pushing everyone into position. The archers took aim. High above, the Black Dragon cut through the clouds. Burning eyes bored into the village below. Rita looked up, a little unnerved, and realized just what they were facing. So this was the Black Dragon, looming ominously above as it scanned the ground below. A cry rings out. "It's here! Shoot!" Arrows launch into the sky, a storm of deadly points. Arrows rained down, battering the dragon. Something pierced its wings and body, and the beast let out a furious, echoing roar of pain. Hilda barked, "Bring it down now!" as the archers kept firing without a pause. Then steady smoke started gathering inside the Black Dragon's mouth, and it opened its jaws wide. Hilda shouted a quick, urgent warning about the breath attack, and yelled for the barrier to rise. The Black Dragon unleashed a massive blast of fire, a roaring wall of flame that surged toward the gathered warriors. But at that moment, a radiant barrier flared up in front of them, taking the worst of the dragon's assault. Yet the very air still pulsed with heat, burning through the magical defense. Rita's eyes widened in shock as she realized that even with the barrier, the heat was unbearable. The dragon's fire faded, smoke trailing from its mouth. The warriors stood frozen, tense and watchful, waiting for its next move. As the smoke slowly dissipated, the Black Dragon hovered high above, glaring down at them with gleaming eyes. It began to rise, slowly drifting higher into the sky. Seizing the moment, Hilda raised her voice and shouted the order to fire. The archers answered at once, sending another volley of arrows into the sky. Suddenly, the Black Dragon froze in midair. Hilda cried out a warning to everyone. It was preparing to unleash its breath again. The Black Dragon opened its mouth and sent out another fiery blast. The warriors raised the barrier a second time. The flaming attack slammed into the glowing shield, protecting the group once more. Amidst the chaos read a question. How long would they have to keep this cycle going? Fire, shield, fire, again and again. Hilda, standing at his side, sighed and admitted she was sorry for dragging him into a fight like this. Rita shot back that he was the one who had chosen to be here in the first place. Despite everything, Hilda breathed a relieved sigh. A rare, precious healer like him was with them. She declared that once they defeated the Black Dragon, she would reward him from the village's treasure collection. And with a warm smile, finally, something that made him feel like a true adventurer, he said he'd be looking forward to it. Hilda shouted another order, noting the dragon's breath was fading. She gave the signal. The archers readied their bows. The call to fire rang out, and a fresh storm of arrows shot into the sky straight at the dragon. Rita stared at the Black Dragon as arrows pierced its body, wings and scales. They struck true. The creature took damage, but he couldn't help wondering, was that truly enough? Could they really win against a monster like this? His resolve flaring, he answered his own question with fierce certainty. They'd win, absolutely. The black dragon unleashed another blast of fire that slammed into the barrier with a thunderous crash. Rita, drenched in sweat, hurriedly cast a healing spell on Hilda's burned shoulder, looking utterly exhausted. You rush to the others, heart pounding as you worry whether anyone else is hurt. Even those who never took the dragon's breath head-on couldn't escape. The scorching air seared them, leaving many in their ranks burned and wounded. At last, the dragon's struck ceased. Hilda spotted her chance, cried for the archers to prepare, and they sent their arrows flying. The black dragon, now flying erratically, twisted to dodge, but several arrows slammed into it. They erupted into a furious roar. Hilda let out a short laugh, watching the dragon grow more and more agitated, oddly unaware of how damaged its own wings were. Rita peered, confused, and realized its wings were indeed severely torn. He shouted in surprise, heart racing. Were all the attacks aimed at that weak spot from the very beginning? Suddenly, smoke began to gather in the dragon's mouth, its stomach ballooning as the smoke thickened into something ominous. Plas warned, this was the dragon's trump card. Hilda shouted for the barrier to snap into place, bracing for the incoming flame bombs. The dragon threw back its jaws and unleashed a massive ball of flame that slammed into the earth, rattling the ground in a violent tremor. Further away, Mina cried out, stunned by the booming noise and the violent tremors. Kate took in the noise and the tremor, then, voice steady, reassured her with calm confidence. A woman wrapped her arm around Mina and whispered that Hildegarda, Claus, and Rita were there, urging her to pray they'd stay safe. Mina shut her eyes and prayed with all her heart, hoping Rita would do his best and come back safe. The enormous fireball slammed into the barrier. Hilda snapped for a double-layered barrier to absorb the strike, and Rita called out that the injured had been treated and would help by pouring his mana into reinforcing the defense. The barrier held against the inferno, and an encouraged warrior grinned, sensing victory. Another agreed and rallied into the fight. But Rita stayed alert and saw the black dragon preparing a second strike. He quickly warned Hilda, who understood the danger at once. The dragon was launching another attack despite its damaged body. Alarmed, she realized how unprecedented dragon's recklessness was, and once more the creature unleashed a devastating attack. Sensing the danger, Hilda pleaded with Rita to escape alone if he had to, but Rita refused. The barrier cracked under the force of the second impact. Desperate, Hilda cried out for more mana. The structure finally shattered, and Rita stood frozen, staring in disbelief. The flame bomb hovered in the air, slowly advancing toward them. Determined, Rita faced it head-on. He refused to die in a place like this. He couldn't. He vowed to return alive, and silently he began casting a spell within his mind. The wind answered, a fierce gust wrapped around him, and a wind spirit appeared behind him. Glowing hands are slipping into Rita's body, merging with her. The spirit unlocked a hidden seal, and thick black smoke began pouring out from within. The wind spirit brushed Rita like a gentle whisper, cheering him on and urging him to give his very best. Black smoke poured from Rita's body, thickening and roaring with power as the seal continued to open. Rita forced his thoughts steady, pinned the spell in his mind, and willed the power into a shield. A massive surge of wind burst forward, roaring into a towering wall that met the incoming flame bomb and shoved it aside. He'd gasp in surprise at the sudden force. Rita, in his thoughts, seemed to shift, the heavy weight on his heart lifting as the lid that sealed his potential vanished and he felt suddenly light. Man rushed into him, overwhelming and exhilarating, and he felt as though there were no limits to what he could do as he called once more to the wind in his mind, invoking its power to form an invisible blade. Fuel by's resolve. A wind blade cut through the air. He lunged and slashed at the black dragon, and the blade struck true. One of the dragon's wings was sliced clean off, and the beast let out a raw, painful shriek, twisting wildly in the air as it lost control and spiraled downward. It slammed into the earth with brutal force. Though still grounded, the dragon heaved itself up and roared in fury, wrenching its mouth open to unleash another breath, only to fail. Its fangs lay shattered and its wings ruined, so it could no longer fly or spew its deadly fire. Reduced to a huge, grounded beast, it gave the warriors an opening and they sprang into action. They steadied themselves, spoke the binding words once more, and thick vines erupted from the ground, snaking up around the dragon's massive frame, constricting it tightly and pinning it in place. Hilda's gaze snapped to Rita, stunned. Her previous impression of him had just crumbled. An unreliable man lay utterly overturned, yet he planted himself like solid ground before the dragon, without a hint of hesitation. She'd thought he was merely a healer, but he'd blocked the dragon's breath, cut off its wings, and now had it restrained. She trembled, not with fear but with wild exhilaration. She'd never seen a man like him, and his strength sent a thrilling shiver through her. Hilda didn't hesitate. She called Rita forward, reached out her hands to him, and asked for his wind magic, her heart pounding wildly. and when Rita took her hands, a faint blush rose to her cheeks. Their palms met, and a surge ran between them like a current. She urged him to pour more into her, to give everything he had. He responded with all his might. Wind and magic surged and gathered at the tip of her arrow, making it glow with radiant energy. Hilda's voice rang out for all to hear as she declared that she and he would stand against the dragon that had ruined their village. Filled with resolve, she let the arrow fly. The arrow tore through the air with brutal force, aimed straight at the dragon's head, and the beast's eyes went wide as it saw death coming. The moment it struck, a deafening explosion tore through the air. Wind slammed outward in every direction. When the roots that bound the dragon loosened, its huge body hit the ground with a heavy final thud. Blood seeped from its skull. The dragon no longer moved. Rita and Hilda stood silently, facing the fallen creature. He read the question. Was it truly over? He'll return to him and confirm it. It was their victory. She stepped forward and raised her voice for all the warriors to hear, triumph in her tone, calling them to cry out so their victory cries would echo through the forests and mountains, and tell anyone who would listen that they were here and they had won. The elves burst into joyful cheers, celebrating their forest and land and their new friends Rita Dixon and Mina Dixon, while laughter filled the air as the whole village gathered to enjoy the feast prepared for the occasion. Present Rita with a drink and watch his reaction. Rita tasted the fruit wine and smiled, savoring its flavor. Edith giggled at his obvious pleasure and teased him about how much he loved wine. Rita, a little embarrassed, scratched his head as his thoughts wandered to her beauty, and he wondered why she looked so lovely. And Mina, bright as always, praised the taste of the juice and the food, savoring the moment. Kate, sitting beside her, went bright red and bashfully encouraged her to try even more dishes, and Mina answered warmly, smiling at him. She said it felt like they were celebrating another festival. Rita agreed. Kate, confused, asked what kind of festival it was. While they ate, Mina explained that 10 days earlier they'd had a festival in Morelia to celebrate exterminating the demon wolves. Edith gasped and even commented on the feat, amazed that Rita had played a part in killing those creatures. And Rita, modest, just shrugged that it was a team effort, like their fight with the Black Dragon. But then his expression turned serious. Despite their victory over the Black Dragon, he realizes tougher challenges still lie ahead. At that moment, Edith caught his eye and pointed to the tiny seed cupped in her palm. Rita instantly recognized it as one from the fruit they had eaten. Without a sound, Edith summoned the Earth Spirit's power, and the sea answered, swelling up rapidly. Mina stared in awe, and Edith said elves have a gift for nursing plants back to health, though the big tree will need about 3 years to recover. The other trees, however, will be covered in summer foliage again soon. Suddenly, the village elder rushed up and apologized for the delay. Red, who had been worrying about their absence, listened as Claus explained they have been discussing Rita's reward. The elder, speaking earnestly, admitted that even giving him everything in the village's storage wouldn't be enough, so they agreed that Rita should receive 30% of the money from selling the Black Dragon. Rita stood speechless, stunned by the generous offer, while the elder insisted that she had already done more than enough to deserve it. Claw added his own plea, begging Rita to accept it for Mina's future. Rita fell silent, thoughts heavy, and after a while he agreed, promising to use the reward wisely. Claw then remembered the moment Rita slipped the Black Dragon into his item box. He'd already been stunned by Rita's wind barrier and wind blade, but seeing how massive his item box's storage was left him speechless, and Rita, a little embarrassed, admitted he had expected it to be full too, especially after putting the wings inside. The elder said that, thanks to his actions, they didn't even have to take the dragon apart on the spot. They could move it to a human town in perfect condition. And Claus, smiling, explained the money would pay for rebuilding, and that the village had decided to start engaging with humans from that moment on. Rita blinked, stunned by the sudden shift, and couldn't help but admit the decision was incredible. At that moment, Hilda cut in, saying the rewards weren't finished yet. The elder and Claus turned to her, puzzled, and Hilda stared at Rita, bluntly pointing out that he had no spouse, leaving Rita blinking in confusion and waiting for an explanation. With a wide, confident smile, Hilda declared her decision. She, Hilda Garda Edera, would become his wife, and the village fell into stunned silence. Everyone froze in disbelief. Rita was completely shocked, his jaw dropping as he clutched his head in a panic, while murmurs spread quickly among the elves. Some couldn't believe it was really Hildegarda making that declaration. One elf said she was acting just like her older sister. Another asked out loud if Hilda really meant to marry a human. Hilda, fed up with the way they talked about her, snapped at them, her voice sharp with anger. Meanwhile, Mina tugged on the elder's robe, curiosity shining in her eyes as she asked whether Hilda had an older sister. The elder gently patted her head and nodded, saying it was something both she and their son-in-law ought to know. And Rita, confused and awkward, repeated the phrase in stunned disbelief. Son-in-law? The elder pressed on with his explanation. Hildegarda, it turned out, had an older sister. Among the few children born into the tribe were sisters whose bond ran unusually deep, and their connection had been truly special. But 50 years ago, when Hilda turned 260, her sister had eloped, throwing aside the customs of their people. She had fled with the human, breaking the elven law that forbade contact with humans. Ever since that incident, Hilda's hatred for humans had deepened into something raw and fierce, and with her voice trembling from grief and rage, she cried out, damning the humans who had stolen her sister away. In defiance of the sister who had abandoned her in the tribe, Hilda poured every ounce of herself into becoming a warrior. She scorned love and a romance as meaningless and vowed to live as a warrior. Claus, remembering that moment, teasingly echoed her old vow to live as a warrior. But suddenly Hilda's tone changed. She spoke slowly, her voice dropping into a low, threatening pitch as she addressed the Claus directly, then drew her sword and launched an aggressive strike. Claus, brimming with confidence, stepped forward and fought her up close. The elves around them burst into wild cheers, utterly thrilled by the sudden duel between the two warriors. Amid the excitement, Rita turned to Mina with an uneasy smile and asked if his earlier claim about marriage was serious. Mina shot back, challenging his thoughts. The celebration died with the night, and when morning finally arrived, a teleportation circle had been etched into the ground, ready for departure. Kate, cheerful and bright, laughed that he'd come back someday, and Mina beamed, promising she'd wait for his next visit. Before they left, Hilda came up to Rita and gently explained she wouldn't be able to be with him for a while, urging him not to be too sad and promising she'd come to him soon. And Rita answered hesitantly, unsure whether Hilda still meant everything she'd said. Hilda, smiling proudly, confessed that she had finally come to understand her sister's feelings, how natural it was to want to live with a man one had fallen in love with. Stunned, Rita asked if she had really fallen for him. Hilda answered without doubt, passionate and steady. Her feelings were real, deep and sincere. Suddenly, Claus interjected with a teasing echo of Hilda's old vow to become a warrior, and an annoyed Hilda responded by punching him square in the face. The elder gently placed a hand on Rita's shoulder, confirming the moment and accepting Rita as their son-in-law, while Rita let out an awkward laugh, quietly struggling with how fast everything was moving. The class signal rang out. It was time to leave, and Rita agreed. The elves gathered, sending them off with warm wishes and heartfelt farewells, and Rita cheerfully returned their farewell. The magic circle flared to life, whisking them away from the forest. As they returned, Rita buzzed with excitement over the journey, encountering a dragon and meeting the elves. He imagined how surprised the guild and Malay would be when they heard what had happened. Back at the Amulus guild, Malay's voice broke as he shouted in distress. Malay demanded to know why Rita had disappeared so suddenly without any warning. Rita suddenly realized she wasn't just angry, she was crying too. Malay confessed she'd been terribly worried, especially since he had taken Mina with him for 2 full days. Rita and Mina bowed together, apologizing sincerely. Malay, overwhelmed and shaking with broken sobs, said she had been terrified that something terrible had happened. She had worried they had abandoned the guild altogether. Her thoughts had been chaotic, imagining all sorts of worst-case scenarios. Tears spilling, she grabbed Rita's hand tight and, sobbing, thanked him for coming back. Claw pulled off his robe, revealing himself and telling them Rita had left town to help, and Malay's eyes went wide in shock when she recognized him as an elf. Finally, they told how it had happened, Malay writing down every detail and repeating what she'd heard. And after healing the elves in their village, Rita had defeated a black dragon, which Rita confirmed simply. Malay warned the reconstruction would be costly and asked whether they wanted the guild to assess the black dragon. Klaus agreed. Realization hit the Lay. She suddenly remembered that Rita had an item box and wondered whether he had really brought the dragon back with him. She shook her head in disbelief, trying to convince herself it couldn't be true. A dragon fitting into an item box felt unthinkable, and her thoughts were a tangled mess. Embarrassed, Rita scratched his head and gave a sheepish laugh. Malay answered with a nervous, awkward chuckle. Klaus confirmed the dragon had indeed been brought, and now everyone was counting on her to assess it. Malay froze in horror and yelled that they must not take it out inside the guild. The place was too cramped, and out at that remote branch no one had the qualifications to appraise it. Klaus agreed. This was going to be trouble. Rita asked if they'd have to go to the capital. Malay begged for a long moment, promising to summon someone qualified to assess and transport the black dragon from the capital. Rita, surprised and even fainter, looked on as Klaus asked how long it would take, and Malay paused to calculate before estimating about 2 weeks. Claus accepted it and told them he'd return to the village. Before leaving, he added that the Elven village had decided to use this chance to start building relations with humans, and that they'd be relying on Malay going forward. Malay grabbed his hand, nodded firmly, and in a steady, determined voice said he'd report it to the higher-ups. They'd be expecting her in 2 weeks. Afterward, they stepped outside the guild, and Claus piped up that he'd buy some baked goods for Kate and Edith. Rita laughed, called him a good father, and Claw grinned back, saying Rita was one too. Then he gave Rita a formal goodbye, thanking him for everything, and Rita returned the sentiment. Claw gently patted Mean's head and said he'd bring Kate next time so the two of them could play together, and Mean responded cheerfully. They parted with warm waves and smiles. Rita grew quiet, his thoughts drifting. If you were a father, you'd need to ask her seriously about her feelings. Mina, spotting his silence, giggled and asked what he was thinking about. Rita said they'd need to apologize to Riggs and Moran too, and Mina agreed. When they returned at the end, Moran greeted them with a loud, emotional cry that startled them both. Night slowly crept over the town. A voice echoed in the dark, low and ominous. Someone vowed they wouldn't let her be happy alone, and when it turned toward the sound, it froze to see Rita standing there with a grim, unreadable look. A girl in a robe stood beside him, blood-red tears spilling from her eyes. Silently, she drew her sword and raised it, as if to read his neck. Without warning, she slashed across. Mina screamed in horror, begging him to stop. A sharp gasp tore from her as she jolted awake. That dream had been a nightmare. Her chest heaved in quick, shaky breaths as she fought to calm herself. Rita Laba sighed and drifted peacefully back to sleep. She stared at him in silence, fear still clutching her heart, tears welling in her eyes as she gently took his hand in hers, whispering his name soft and trembling with tears. Rita Chon. At the Amulus Guild, Rita pressed about Mina. Had anyone been looking for her? Malay answered that she'd called everywhere, from the capital's central headquarters to the tiniest guild branches. But there was no news. She bowed, apologizing that she hadn't been of much help, and Rita immediately reassured her, thanking her sincerely for everything she'd done. Their conversation over, Rita sprang up and turned to Mina, who could be waiting patiently. He told her there were no quests today and with a small shrug suggested they take a walk. Cut mild out, agreed. They stepped out of the guild and strolled lazily through the town. They stopped at a bakery and decided to go inside. Mina looked around the shop, eyes wide with wonder, clearly fascinated. They offered Cookie a sample and found it delicious, admiring its taste and texture, while Mina, cheerful, agreed as she bit into hers, appreciating how crispy it was. Rita watched her quietly, a soft smile on his face. He felt a deep relief swell inside him, glad to see her lively again. Only a few nights ago she had been crying out in her sleep, clearly haunted by a nightmare. But now she seemed to be getting her usual spark back. Soon after they wandered into another part of town. Mino pointed excitedly at a fish display, marveling at how shiny and beautiful the fish looked, and Rita agreed, admiring them alongside her. Inside, his feelings flared up again. He couldn't bear to leave this girl alone anymore. It was time for a proper, honest conversation. Suddenly Rita called out to her, voice urgent, saying there was something he needed to discuss. Mina asked him what it was. Rita said it simply and honestly. He wasn't married. He'd never raised a child. But if she wanted, he wanted them to be a family, father and daughter. Mina turned to him, surprised, and asked if he really meant it. But just then an unfamiliar voice cut in, firm and unyielding, declaring that it was absolutely not acceptable. Rita instinctively lunged to shield Mina and spun toward the voice. A hooded figure stood close by, staring at them with a menacing look, and in a mocking tone the stranger addressed Rita, calling him out. Rita narrowed his eyes and asked who she was. The figure pulled back her hood, revealing herself as a young woman. She stood there, mysterious and intimidating. Mina froze with wide eyes and shouted the name she hadn't spoken in so long, and Rita, her older sister, caught off guard, asked if she was truly Mina's sister. The girl smiled and said softly, "It's been a while. I've been searching for you." Her smile was like a blade, cold and unnerving, but she let out a breath of relief when she saw Mina unharmed. But her mood flipped in an instant, the girl's face snapping into a furious scowl as she brought up Rita's proposal. She furiously rejected the idea of them becoming a family, and with lightning-fast reflexes she hurled a dagger at them. Rita barely dodged at the last second, stunned. She demanded an explanation, but the girl scoffed, mocking how slow her attack had been, and how he still managed to react in time. Mina cried out in disbelief, calling for her sister, but her sister coldly told her to be quiet. She said it plainly. She'd kill the old man first, then come from Mina. Fear trembled in Mina's voice. Rita, confused and horrified, asked what she was talking about, but the girl didn't slow. She hurled another dagger at him, shouting for him to shut up. Rita, try to think this through. Wasn't she mean as an older sister? The girl confirmed it. She introduced herself as Luna. Then she leapt down from a rooftop, her movements fluid and practiced. She announced she was the sister of the girl he'd falsely proposed to. Rita sized up her form and movement, her posture, the force of her presence. She was dangerous, highly skilled. He turned to Mina and urgently told her to take cover behind one of the bridge pillars. Still confused but trusting him, Mina obeyed, and Rita turned back to Luna and asked why she would go so far as to say she would kill her own sister. Luna's voice turned to ice as she rebuked him for using her name, telling him not to address her so familiarly. And at that moment, another dagger flew toward him. Read it. Cast a defensive spell immediately. Even so, the blade skimmed a shoulder, drawing blood. Luna Grind sneered at his delayed reaction and raised a barrier. Mina cried out to her sister, pleading for an explanation and begging her to stop. Luna's face went dark, and in a low voice she asked why. Then, with a blast of rage, she lunged forward, accusing Rita of being nothing but scum trying to take advantage of her sister. And then she charged at him with her dagger. She moved like a coiled storm, fast and fierce. She swung her dagger to hurt, but Rita slipped away at the last second, confused and alarmed, and he asked, voice tight, what she meant by using her. Luna pressed on with a relentless assault, forcing Rita to conjure another barrier in defense. She sneered and accused him of growing stronger in magic ever since he met Mina. Rita froze for a heartbeat as the realization hit her. Luna pounced on the pause, leaping into the air with a victorious smirk as she declared his reaction proved she was right. Then she sent a volley of daggers his way, screaming again that he was only using Mina's gifted skill. Rita raised his berry again, asking what she meant by a gift, while he ducked beneath a flurry of blades. He quietly admitted to himself that the attack had nearly caught him off guard. Luna Preston, her voice sharp with disbelief as she asked if he really didn't know, revealed that Mina possessed a unique skill, one that amplified the power of nearby allies. Realization slammed into Rita. His ability explained how he'd healed so many wounded and even severed the black dragon's wings with a single blow. Luna frowned, puzzled by his genuine tone and his unexpected reaction. Mina cried out again, pleading with her sister to stop and insisting Rita wasn't a bad person. But at that moment, one of Luna's daggers flew straight at her. Rita's barrier held firm and stopped it, and a furious Luna reminded them she had already said Mina was next. Rita shouted in disbelief, her voice cracking as she questioned what she'd done, and he asked how she could do this to her own sister. Weren't they family? Luna's voice turned icy as she confirmed they were family, and then said she'd been watching them for days. That was exactly why she meant to rescue Mina from a filthy man like him. She swore she'd drag Mina back and kill her to end it, then unleashed another flurry of daggers as Rita raised his barrier again. But one slip zipped past and struck his shoulder. Mina called his name in a panic. Rita turned to her and told her he was fine. Luna then fixed her gaze on Mina and softly coaxed her, saying if they went back together, everything would be forgiven. Mina shook her head, refusing outright. She told Luna she wouldn't go back and kept insisting her sister was acting strangely. While tending his wound, Rita admitted softly that he still didn't fully understand what was going on. He could see that Mina was clearly terrified of wherever Luna meant to take her, and he pointed out that Luna's behavior made no sense, talking about taking Mina away and then killing her, her words and actions totally incoherent, until Luna snapped and yelled at him to shut up. She charged again, screaming that if he simply didn't exist, things would be fine. Clutching her dagger, she lunged forward as Rita shouted, begging for a proper conversation. Mina, watching the confrontation, cried out desperately, begging her sister not to hurt her father. Rita activated another barrier, but then Luna suddenly froze in place, leaving Rita staring in confusion as Luna clenched her teeth, and her eye color began to change. A tear slid down her cheek as she muttered through clenched teeth that it wasn't fair. Her voice trembled with pain and despair as she whispered, "Why? Why do things turn out like this?" Tears wouldn't stop falling as she suddenly crumpled to her knees, groaning in agony, and Rita called out to her, her voice thick with concern. But Luna, in a panic, leapt back and shouted at him not to come any closer. She pulled her robe over her head to hide her face, her eyes still full of tears. She shot into the air and vanished into the distance, racing far away from them. Rita whispered to himself about those eyes, about what he'd just seen. Mina ran toward him, shouting his name, her voice trembling as she asked if he was all right, and Rita gently reassured her that he was fine. He asked her the same thing, and Mina confirmed she was okay. Then he faltered for a beat. She whispered to Rita how overjoyed she'd been when he said he wanted them to be a family. And Rita, just as sincere, answered that she agreed. She wanted him to be her family too. Mina trembled, torn by feeling, and finally admitted that Luna was still family too. She couldn't understand what had happened. Her sister had been acting so strange, so unlike herself. She clutched his hand, trying to read the lines on his palm. She begged him, voice trembling, "Please save Luna." Rita pulled her close and told her not to worry. He would figure something out. Min nodded in trust. Later, back at the end, Mina had drifted off to sleep. He read quietly for a second in the corner of the room, a book open in his hands. He muttered softly as he read, the words settling into a quiet resolve. He'd do something, definitely. Mina still remembered the painful days before she ever met Rita. Back then, she had lived with her sister, not in peace, but inside a secret underground organization. Life there had been cruel. Mina was born with a skill called the Gift. It boosted the power of anyone near her, and for that she was chained, restrained, and forced to use her ability on multiple people each day. She couldn't activate it at will, and the organization, fed up with how unreliable her power was, soon lost interest. Her role shifted. Instead of a useful asset, she was stripped down to nothing but a hostage, a bargaining chip to keep her sister under control. Luna, the older sister, had shown astonishing physical skill. The organization saw her talent, turned her into a weapon, and trained her as an assassin. The order was clear: eliminate anyone who betrayed the organization or stood against it. With that power, she could have run, but she didn't, because Mina was still there. Had she been alone, Luna could have slipped away at any moment, yet she stayed, for Mina's sake. Then one day, minus on opportunity, the guards had drunk themselves unconscious and the keys had clattered to the floor. With quiet hands she took them, unlocked her chains, and at last broke free. In that moment she truly believed Luna, with all her strength, could escape too. From this moment on, everything would change. Now, in this very moment, Rita and Mina walked together down a path. You stopped and asked, "Will this place do?" Then he turned and called into the air, his voice clear as he summoned Luna. He knew she was close and told her to show herself. Luna slipped out from her hiding place and stepped in front of them. She fixed Rita with narrowed eyes and asked if he had decided to give Mina up without a fight. Mina's voice shook as she called to her sister, but Rita answered firmly. He wasn't here to surrender. He had come to treat her, and Luna lifted an eyebrow in puzzled surprise before twisting it into a mocking smirk. So, in her mind, he'd come to die, and she asked if he really thought his barrier could hold against her full power. Rita replied calmly that today he intended to get a bit serious too, and quietly cast a spell in his mind. "O Spirit of the Flames," as spheres of fire suddenly began to appear around him, swirling with heat and power. Caught off guard, Luna cried out in shock as the fierce flames made her tense. But before he had a chance to unleash the spell, she lunged forward, all fire and resolve, determined to stop him first. She hurled daggers at Rita, each one striking with deadly accuracy. Rita's gaze sharpened. He activated his item box, and in the blink of an eye the daggers winked out of the air. Luna screamed in disbelief, frozen as her weapons winked out of existence. And Rita, about to comment, muttered that she probably wouldn't enjoy what was coming next. "Cast another spell. Set the enemy on fire. Then shout the incantation. Fireball!" Fireballs burst from the sky, arcing toward Luna. She gritted her teeth and exploded into motion, darting, leaping and twisting with sharp precision to dodge every attack. The onslaught never stopped. Fireballs kept crashing down. She was forced to shield herself with her daggers as she moved, each blast lighting up the sky. Rita activated his item box again. The fireballs kept chasing her, driving Luna to put more distance between herself and them. Frustrated, she growled under her breath. If ranged attacks wouldn't work, she'd simply close the distance. Suddenly, Luna reappeared behind them, and Mina shouted her name, jolted by the unexpected movement. But Rita stayed calm and instantly cast another spell at the shield. A magic circle flared to life beneath Luna's feet. Her eyes widened as the realization slammed into her. He'd baited her into exactly the spot he wanted. A violent gust erupted from the ground, blasting her backward through the air. She cried out in pain as she was sent flying. Rita declared that now he could capture her. He cast another spell, and glowing chains sprang from the air to bind her. With a shout, thin magical chains snaked around Luna's body and tightened, leaving her unable to move. As she stumbled, Rita caught her gently in his arms, holding her close. Mina sighed in relief, and softly called out to her sister. Luna glared at him, fury blazing in her eyes as she shouted for him to let her go. She spun to Mina, yelling with fury and demanding what she meant by abandoning her. Mina shot back that Luna had it all wrong. Teeth grinding, Luna snapped she'd drag her sister back and kill her. Rita, still calm, smiled and told her she had done enough. She'd worked hard, and now it was all right. Luna looked at him, confused, and asked what nonsense he was talking about. He cast another spell to strip away the control over her. When his hand brushed her face, a magic circle bloomed, glowing softly. Luna gasped as a memory slammed back. Clear as day, the face of a man, the leader of their rival organization, smiling with cold malice as he praised her. "Good job, Luna. Now on to the next one." His voice snapped back in his memory, harsh and hollow. He bellowed the incantation that summoned the cane of domination, and with dark authority, he unleashed his command. Luna Perez was on a mission to bring back her younger sister, Mina Perez, who had fled, and anyone who dared stand in her way would be killed without a second thought. Luna, overcome by panic, couldn't make sense of it. Asshole was happening. When a black smoke burst from the cane, curling violently into the air as her wide, pain-filled eyes slowly darkened until they turned pitch black. She screamed as agony tore through her, while the man cursed, spat insults, and blamed it all on Mina's escape before invoking the cane's power again. Darkness swallowed her as influence poured into Luna like a flood, and she trembled, racked with pain, barely able to breathe. Every week she whispered Mina's name, and later Luna stood atop a high ledge, staring down with sharp, hawk-like eyes. A smirk tugged at her lips when she spotted her target below. She found Mina, the mission, the compulsion, told her they would now return home. But a voice stirred inside her, rebelling against the order. "No," it said. "She won't take her back." Luna collapsed to her knees, silently screaming in agony. She clutched her head and muttered Mina's name again, clinging desperately to anything beyond the pain as her eyes shimmered and shifted color once more, tears streaming down her cheeks. From above she watched Mina's innocent, radiant smile, and when the voice echoed again it was warmer this time. Thank God, she's happy. A sudden knife-sharp headache tore through Luna's skull, and she winced, muttering in frustration. Why am I the only one suffering like this?" From below came a mean giggle as someone patted her head. Luna watched on, whispering bitterly. "It's not fair." The voice inside her mind responded. What even is she? Her thoughts spiraled. She dropped to her knees and kept repeating the same words. "Not fair, not fair." Her emotions spiraled out of control inside her own mind as Luna screamed. She was losing herself. Her inner voice cried out, "No, wait, stop!" But it was already too late. The darkness was overwhelming her. She realized in a flash of dread that she couldn't control the domination anymore. Her rationality slipped and her humanity flickered. She whispered, "No one, someone," and her eyes turned pitch black, fully consumed. Tears still streamed down her face as she muttered through clenched teeth, "I'll kill her." Even as rage ate her up, a small part of her kept crying in silence. "Someone save?" Rita's voice rang out through the air, firm and bright. He would save her right now. A blinding light surged outward. Luna's blackened eyes began to crack, and then, with a sudden burst of magical force, the darkness shattered completely. Her original eyes appeared again, wide and brimming with tears. She gasped as she realized what had happened. Mina called to her softly, worry threading every word. Luna jumped away from Rita's arms, and when Mina moved closer, Luna shouted for her to stay back. She clutched her chest and cried, drowning in guilt. She confessed she'd been thinking terrible things. When she saw Mina happy, something ugly clenched and twisted in her heart. Why only her? Her jealousy had turned into something far worse. Mina shook her head, sobbing, and kept telling her it was all right. She knew her sister well. Trembling, Luna apologized again, explaining that seeing Mina living peacefully had made her act without thinking, and she admitted she was wrong. Mina stepped closer, tears falling, and apologized for running off alone back then. She hadn't wanted to leave her sister behind and begged for forgiveness, but Luna refused to blame her, saying Mina had nothing to apologize for. Then, suddenly, she turned to Rita and spoke to him, begging, no, pleading, that he protect Mina. While she vowed to return to the organization herself, she would lie and say she'd killed Mina. By then, somehow. Mina panicked and reached out to her sister, her voice shaking as she asked what she was saying. What did she mean? Rita shouted that she couldn't do that. He said that if she went back alone, they'd still come after them. He'd protect her too. He wanted them all to stay together from now on. Luna trembled where she stood. Her fists were clenched tight. Rita reminded her that Mina had already said she would become his family, so Luna too. She was his family now. Luna gave a bitter laugh and said his words sounded like a proposal. Rita didn't back down. He pulled her close and said it didn't matter what she called it if she saw that Mina was happy here. Then he'd make Luna happy too. He asked her to become family with him and Mina. Luna's jaw dropped as she stared at him, utterly speechless. Then, overwhelmed by emotion, she burst into tears, nodded and let out a trembling, "Yes." Through tear-blurred eyes and a gentle smile, she told him she would be in his care. Mina ran up and threw her arms around her, shouting her name. Luna held her sister tight, sobbing and saying sorry for making her worry. Rita folded them both into a hug as Mina kept crying, one each on. Under the vast, quiet sky, the three of them held each other close, their tears falling in silence, finally, together. They returned to the inn. Mina laughed joyfully, a bright smile on her face as she called Rita Dad. Mirren blinked, surprised by the change, and said how much cheerier Mina had become. Riggs leaned forward, curious, and asked about the new girl with them. A slight blush warmed her cheeks as she introduced herself formally as Luna Dixon, Mina's real sister, and politely greeted him. Rita cast a hesitant glance at her and paused. Luna caught his stare and asked what he was looking at. And Rita said he was just wondering how she planned to address him, leaving Luna silent and unsure how to answer. She drifted into a deep, quiet thought. Then, in an instant, a grin crossed her face. An idea had just come to her. With a teasing lilt, she said she'd call him Papa from now on. Riggs laughed and asked if there was any deeper meaning. Mirren, a little stunned, asked if a proposal had happened between them, and Luna answered confidently that it was true. He had proposed to her, and since he already had a daughter, she had every right to call him Papa. Reed panicked, flailed his hands, and insisted it wasn't like that. Luna was still a minor, but she stepped closer and teased him, saying she'd be an adult next month. Papa. With a cheerful grin, Luna announced they should go to the guild, hauling Mina and Rita along. Rita, taken aback, asked if she had really meant all that about making him her family. Luna tilted her head in mock confusion and teased him again, asking if he was really that kind of person. Mina, watching from the side, chuckled and said her older sister looked like she was having fun. Riggs looked on with a warm smile and said things were about to get a lot noisier now that the room had filled. Later at the guild, Morelia announced the task was finished and asked Mina, with a hopeful look, if she was happy to be reunited with her sister. Mina beamed and answered yes. Then Luna suddenly turned to Morelia and, out of the blue, said something unexpected. They'd visit again next month. Luna announced she wanted to formalize her marriage to Rita, and Morelia flinched, stunned by the suddenness and struggling to find words. She stammered but finally nodded with a small smile, while Rita, equally surprised, asked Luna what she was talking about. Luna shrugged and said coolly that he was the one who'd promised to make her happy, and had claimed her as family. She accepted with a soft smile. It felt only natural. Morelia caught on and grinned playfully, saying she'd be looking forward to the occasion. Rita blinked in shock and turned to her, protesting. A week after they'd officially become a family with Mina and Luna, the three of them strolled through town together. A familiar voice called out to Rita, first a text, then Elliot, asking if the trio was heading out on another job. Rita greeted them warmly, explaining he had only just come back from patching up an injured person that morning, and Elliot warned that the warmer weather was stirring the monsters and urged them to stay on their guard. Luna chirped cheerfully that there was nothing to worry about. If monsters showed up, she'd handle them easily. She turned to Rita with bright, hopeful eyes seeking his agreement, and he nodded awkwardly. Elliot laughed, promising he'd be counting on her. Rita quietly added that he didn't want them to act too recklessly. Text laughed and said it was fine. They all looked full of energy. Then, grabbing Rita by the shoulder, he leaned in and whispered to him about going to a nice pub for a drink. Rita confessed he'd be thrilled, but if his daughters ever found out, it would be terrifying. Luna called to him. "Time to head back. We're both starving." Text gave in with a chuckle, saying he didn't want to cause trouble, and Rita agreed. He told himself that if Mina ever looked at him with disgust, it would be the end of him. He pictured her scowling and calling him a filthy dad, and the thought alone nearly crushed him. Mina called his name, snapping him out of his thoughts. He scratched his head, apologized, and said it was time to go. "Be careful. Make sure you say goodbye to the men." As they walked back to the end, Luna suddenly turned to Rita and asked him what he'd meant earlier about a nice pub, and Rita nearly choked, flustered and scrambling for an answer. He blurted out, breathless, that the Tex had invited him out for a drink. Luna leaned in, her voice dropping as she whispered something to Mina. Mina whirled to Rita with mock disapproval and accused him, snapping, "That's filthy." Rita froze, his face going pale. Mina asked Luna if she'd done well. Luna laughed and showered her with praise. Rita protested, insisting he really wouldn't go to that kind of place. When things finally wound down, Mina rolled up her sleeves to help Moran clean, while Luna helped the Riggs get the food ready. Then a knock sounded at the door, and a polite voice asked if Rita Dixon Sand lived there. Upstairs, Rita was deep into his magic studies when a sudden knock sliced through the quiet. Mina answered the door and shouted, "There's a visitor!" Luna added casually, "It's a girl." Curious, Rita asked who it might be, and Mina suddenly realized she'd forgotten to ask the visitor's name. Luna teased Rita, wondering aloud if it might be an ex-girlfriend come to take him back and warning she'd get serious if that were the case, and Rita spun around, baffled, asking what she meant by that. He stepped down the stairs and found a familiar face waiting. The girl gasped in recognition, delighted that it really was him. Read his sand. It was none other than a former party member, Aisha, Orlo. Rita blinked, stunned, and shot out. "Are you really Aisha Orlo?" He then asked what had brought her there. Aisha answered, barely offering a reason. It was explained that after Jill Sand kicked him out, she had also quit the Jet Black Wolves, and a confused Rita blurted that she had only just joined the Jet Black Wolves. Luna, listening from the side, suddenly said she'd heard her papa used to be an adventurer. He'd learned he'd been kicked out of his former party, and, confused, he wondered why. Aisha, visibly angry, asked the same question, remembering how she'd questioned the leader Jill about it. He said coldly that if she didn't like it, she could quit. Furious, she did. Luna raised an eyebrow in disbelief, finding it strange that anyone would kick out a rare healer like Rita. Then a sudden realization struck her, and she voiced her suspicion aloud. "Did he perhaps do something to the girls at the party?" Rita stood frozen, stunned by the implication. He said both Nikto and Rosalie had actually been after Jill, not him, and Mina turned to Aisha, eyes bright with curiosity, asking what her own situation had been. Aisha froze awkwardly, unsure how to answer. And just as she opened her mouth to suggest something, a panicked look washed over her and she clapped a hand to her lips, cutting herself off. He brushed it off, saying they should drop the subject, and instead asked why she had come to find him. Aisha said that after quitting the party, she spent a while doing low, thankless work that never paid off or felt worth the trouble, until a flyer about immigrating to Amulus caught her eye and she decided to come. Now she beams with pride as a member of the local vigilante group and a gatekeeper at the Lord's mansion, truly happy with the life she's found here. She read it and nodded, realizing that joining the vigilante group and working for the Lord would give her a steady income. Aisha agreed, adding that she intended to send money back to the countryside where she had been raised as an orphan. She changed the subject and said she'd actually heard about Rita through some wild, jaw-dropping rumors, that Rita had defeated a dragon in the elf village. Luna froze in pure shock and asked if it was true, that he had defeated a dragon in an elf village. Mina smiled proudly and cheerfully confirmed it, saying their dad had worked really hard, while Aisha, still stunned, admitted she'd at first thought it was someone else with the same name, and asked if the rumors were actually true. Rita let out a nervous laugh and admitted that even he was surprised it had happened. Luna and Aisha both froze, stunned and unable to believe it. Aisha paused, then calmly looked back over the last few weeks and realized that in just 3 weeks, Rita and Jill had grown so different it was impossible to miss. Rita asked, voice tight, if maybe the Jet Black Wolves hadn't managed to reach B rank. Aisha shook her head. That wasn't the problem. Instead, Jill and Gileiam had plunged into banditry and were now wanted criminals. Rita was left speechless as he asked how things had escalated so far, and Aisha explained she'd had the chance to speak with Rosalie just before coming to Amulus. She could still hear that conversation, the moment she asked Rosalie if she'd left the Jet Black Wolves, and Rosalie quietly confirmed that she and Nikto had both quit. Rosalie said that even after kicking Rita out, Jill and Gileiam stubbornly refused to upgrade their gear, spiraled into reckless behavior, and were flirting with death. Jill, more than anyone else, was the worst. He always seemed miles away in his thoughts. They kept shouting that they didn't need a guy like that, acting like he was obsessed, and it had become frightening and confusing. Aisha asked if Rosalie had ever loved Jill, and Rosalie admitted she had, once, but she'd already given up on him. Aisha closed the story with a quiet, pained admission. She hadn't been able to pay the treatment costs. Jill and Gileiam had borrowed money and eventually fled. That was when they turned to banditry. Rita, stunned by everything he'd just heard, scratched his head and looked utterly disheartened. He remembered the early days when he first joined the party. Despite the rough patches, they'd been kind and had laughed together often. Mina, sensing his mood, called to him with a gentle voice. Luna softly patted his head and reassured him that it no longer had anything to do with him, and Aisha agreed. Then Aisha shifted gears, her voice playful as she commented on how cute the girls around him were. Aisha teased, jokingly asking if he had perhaps stolen them. Rita flushed and cried out in denial, asking why she would even think that, and Aisha laughed, saying it was just a joke. Luna jumped in, boldly declaring he'd already stolen her heart, while Aisha kept laughing, and Rita spun toward Luna in a panic, crying her name in exasperation. In a crisp, formal tone, Aisha introduced herself as Aisha Orlo, a former member of the Redis party. Mina stepped forward and introduced herself as his daughter, Mina Dixon. Luna came after, saying she was Mina's sister and also his wife, Luna Dixon. Aisha blinked and admitted it sounded complicated. and Rita rushed in to make it clear they were both his daughters. Just daughters. Aisha turned to the other girl and asked who she was. Miran introduced herself and said she wanted to hear tales of Rita's adventures, and Aisha said she must be the innkeeper's daughter. Mina, eyes sparkling, asked excitedly to hear about Rita's past. Aisha looked to Rita for permission, and Rita smiled, saying he didn't think his adventurer days were that exciting, and found it embarrassing to talk about himself, so he asked Aisha to tell it for him. Luna leaned in, excitement bright in her eyes, and said she wanted to hear specifically about his relationships with women. Rita immediately told Aisha to skip that part, and Aisha cheerfully agreed. They drew in a long, deep breath. Aisha declared she'd begin by telling the story of how Rita once saved her. Rita watched her and suddenly felt a rush of anxiety. Just as Aisha was about to begin, a sudden thought hit her and she shouted. She turned to Rita and, breathless, explained that the Lord had made a request through the guild to bring back a healer named Rita. She had already made the arrangements, and the carriage was waiting outside. "Read it to us," then shouted out in stunned disbelief. The carriage rolled along the road as Rita, Mina, and Luna sat in a heavy, wordless silence. The silence broke as a single question rang out. What exactly did the Lord want from him? Why had he gone so far as to send a carriage? Aisha said she hadn't been told any details, only that she had to bring him. She hinted she might have a guess, but warned it was confidential. Mina couldn't hide her curiosity, and asked what kind of person the Lord was. "When I asked what she meant by that, you should have said they were a bit odd," Aisha elaborated. Unlike most nobles, this man had land passed down from his ancestors. Yet he chose to build a town from scratch in a remote region near the border. I read a comment that said, that was quite an impressive decision. Aisha added that the Lord himself had joined the vigilante group to patrol the area, and had even pitched in to help the doors with construction work for the town's defenses and housing. Lunar said with a wry smile that he really was an unusual noble. Aisha pointed out that, because of this, they might already have brushed past him while wandering through town. Just then, Mina cried out with excitement as she spotted the mansion, and Aisha confirmed it was the Lord's mansion, asking for a moment's attention. The coachman nodded once without a word, and the carriage rolled onward. A voice asked what the matter was. Luna yawned and casually said they were guests, and Rita shot a mean, confused glance. Rita leaned toward the window and whispered in surprise. Armed men had appeared and were closing in, gathering in front of the carriage to block the way. And one of them, who looked like the leader, arrogantly said it was kind of them to stop before being ordered. He added, with a cruel smile, that since they'd been so cooperative, they should just let him kill the people inside, and the other men grinned wickedly behind him. Aisha shoved forward, voice cutting. Did they even know whose carriage this was and where it was headed? The leader snapped that he didn't care. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the healer inside. A voice sliced through the rising tension. Luna declared no firmly and smugly, looking down at the men with a confident expression. Rita, alarmed, called her name, while Aisha, worried, shouted to Luna to stop. It was too dangerous. But in the next moment, a cry of pain echoed. Aisha turned her head quickly. Luna had already darted behind the leader and felled him with a single, clean strike. He collapsed to the ground, utterly unconscious, and Aisha stood rooted in place, stunned. Another man shouted and lunged toward Luna, sword in hand. With swift movement, she countered, driving her dagger into his neck and dropping him instantly. A terrified voice cried out, trembling with confusion. What was this girl? 3 more attackers lunged at her, but Luna moved even faster, reappearing behind them and cutting them down with precise strikes. The others froze as their companions fell, and when Luna turned to face the remaining attackers with a twisted grin, they flinched. She charged forward. The others panicked and yelled at each other to circle her and attack together, but they were no match. Screams and grunts echoed as Luna systematically overwhelmed them. Aisha watched in disbelief and murmured to herself, remembering the rumors of a powerful girl with dark skin and silver blonde hair who had helped the vigilante group and adventurers in monster hunts. Realization struck. It was Ibn Luna all along. Snapping out of her daze, Aisha cried out frantically to Luna, begging her not to kill them. They had to be taken alive. Luna assured her, voice steady, that they were only unconscious. As the dust settled, the attackers were all tied up. Luna plopped down in front of Rita, her eyes sparkling as she silently demanded praise. Rita, a little uneasy, told her she'd done well but warned her not to be so reckless. He and Aisha patted her on the head, and Luna beamed with satisfaction. Aisha stepped forward, voice steady, and said the rest could be left to the vigilante group. They had to move on. The group climbed back into the carriage and left the defeated attackers behind. The ride resumed peacefully as the town slowly slid into view near their destination, and Rita peered through the window, awe bright in her eyes at the mansion while he said how massive and beautiful it was. Mina pointed excitedly at the scenery to catch Luna's eye. Luna cheerfully pointed out the many horses in view, And a nearby voice agreed. It really was quite a sight. Someone spoke the familiar name of a landmark, the Bearded Dwarf Inn. Rita turned to Aisha and said the girls cared more about the sweeping town view than the mansion's grandness, and Aisha laughed, agreeing. At last the carriage reached the Lord the State, where an old man stood waiting and greeted them with a formal bow, thanking Rita Dixon-sama and the young ladies for coming, and the head butler introduced himself as Michel and invited them inside, saying the Lord was waiting. They stepped into this grand mansion as Michel led them down its ornate halls toward the Lord's chamber. As they stepped inside, the Lord greeted them with a calm, proud smile and introduced himself as Tita Amulus Rodenvart, the Lord of Amulus, while the woman at his side quietly gave her name, Gabriella Rodenvart. Rita stepped forward to introduce herself, and Luna and Mina followed with theirs. Tita said he'd heard about what they'd been through, and was truly sorry for letting them get hurt. Both he and his wife bowed low in apology. Luna murmured under her breath, stunned to see nobles bowing to commoners and calling them truly strange, while a blushing Rita gently tried to hush her. Then he told the Lord and Lady their apology was accepted and asked them to lift their heads. Tita thanked him for being so understanding, and Rita then asked what the summons was for. Tita told him to speak freely, and asked Rita not to be so formal. He urged her to just call him Tita, like everyone else, and although Rita agreed, she kept the honorific. Tita moved on to the real reason he'd come. He needed Rita to heal his younger sister Valerie. Rita said they should examine her first. Tita agreed and called for the butler. Miser responded in bout. Tito led them up the stairs, pointing toward Valerie's room. At that moment, Michel turned to Luna and Mina, smiling, and invited them to slip away to enjoy some tea and sweets. Gabriella added, her voice low and urgent, that they preferred not to let the girls see Valerie's condition. Luna said, matter-of-factly, that it couldn't be helped. Mina, showing her support, cheered Rita on and wished him luck. After the girls were led away, Rita asked quietly about Valerie's condition, and Tita said it had started about a year ago. Gabriella painted the scene. That day they were at the villa by the lake, enjoying a family meal. Without warning, flames tore out of Valerie's body. Tita said, voice tight and eyes burning, that even though the flames had looked normal, she'd been bettered in since then. Rita asked if any other healers had tried to treat her, and Tita confirmed, saying even a top healer from the capital's healer guild couldn't heal her wounds. He'd only just started hearing rumors about Rita, a healer active in the Adventures Guild. Tita gently knocked on the door and announced their entrance. Reed stepped into the room, greeted Valerie, and quickly apologized for intruding. They move up to the bedside, staring hard at Valerie. Hullig unconscious. Gabriella slowly peeled the blanket back. Her daughter's body lay exposed, covered in raw, angry burns, and Rita stood frozen, utterly taken aback. He gathered himself, stepped closer, murmured his name to the unconscious girl, and said he was there to treat her. He checked her body carefully and saw that, though the skin wasn't inflamed, the burn's discoloration ran deep and severe. He began casting a healing spell, wondering to himself what the injury really was. Was it just a scar? As he watched, the spot he focused on healed completely, and he couldn't help but be surprised that the skin had returned to normal from just that small healing spell. Then confusion hit him. If it could be healed so easily, why had none of the other healers succeeded? A moment later, his eyes went wide as the skin he'd just healed began to darken again, like the burn was coming back in the exact same spot. He cried out in shock. Tita confirmed it. Valerie would heal for a moment, only for the wound to return, and Gabriella warned the burned area would start spreading again even after it seemed to disappear. Rita watched on, deep in thought. Spontaneous combustion, a wound that kept reopening, a stubborn refusal to heal. This was a massive injury, and he began to suspect something else entirely, something artificial or even magical. So he prepared another spell and announced aloud that he would now test that possibility. Rita activated a detection spell, channeling his magic with steady care as he focused on uncovering the true cause of Valerie's mysterious condition. Rita cast a detection spell on Valerie, and Tita, eyes wide with surprise, asked how he could even use something like detect, remarking that such a spell was unusual. Rita explained it was a staple for adventurers, a beginner-level spell used to sniff out traps and hidden items. He added that anything reacting to magic would glow blue, and enchanted items would give off a white aura. Rita suddenly stopped speaking. His eyes went wide in shock as he identified something unexpected. A black curse. A heavy realization struck him. Valerie was cursed. The air tightened with tension as Tita flinched, disbelief and frustration written all over her, while Gabriella, her voice gentle and heavy with worry, called Valerie's name. Tita asked what they could possibly do when faced with a curse. Gabriella suggested they contact the Healers Guild in the capital. Tita agreed, but admitted she wasn't sure whether even they could handle a curse. At that moment, Rita hesitated, cut in, and asked, her voice trembling, for permission to try the spell he had memorized. But he'd never used magic before. Tita went rigid with astonishment. Then, grabbing at a scrap of hope, he urged Rita to try it once. Rita swallowed and admitted he didn't know how much he could help. But until he'd arrived from the capital, he would at least try to ease Valerie's suffering. He called on his magic and cast the spell in the silence of his mind, a desperate plea to the spirit of light to drive away the forces of evil. A gentle light spilled out as a huge magic circle bloomed beneath Valerie's body. Inside Valerie's mind, voices and heat devoured her thoughts, and she was trapped in darkness, surrounded by searing flames. She could hardly see or hear through the intense heat, overwhelmed and gasping as she called out for help, begging her older brother to save her while the oppressive fire and crushing isolation pushed her to the edge, and her mind began to fracture. Then finally the barrier gave way with a shattering crack, and light burst through the cracks of our consciousness. Tears streamed from her eyes as a blinding light swallowed her. Pain hit her harder. She cried out, reaching for help, while outside Tita noticed her stirring and called her name. Rita reassured them in a warm, steady voice that the curse was lifting bit by bit. Valerie opened her eyes, stared at Rita in confusion and asked who he was, and he said he was a healer. He kept healing, while Gabriella and Tita watched, their faces tight with worry. Inside her, Valerie kept repeating her brother's name. Another wave of pain slammed into her, ripping a scream from her throat. Tita watched with rapt eyes and whispered in awe as the black burn marks began to disappear from her skin, the dark curse markings fading slowly, while Valerie cried out again and clung to Rita as he continued to spell. The last visible scar on her shoulder faded away, and Gabriella, tears of relief streaming down her face, realized the curse was vanishing completely. Rita pleaded with Valerie to hang on just a bit longer as he poured more energy into the spell. Valerie managed a fragile smile through her pain and whispered his name, but Rita's face tightened with strain. The process was burning through his mana fast. He couldn't control the flow. Sweat poured down his face as mounting alarm tightened his chest. He was being drained, his energy spilling out uncontrollably. The spell's glow flared, growing painfully intense. Tita and Gabriella shielded their eyes, wincing at the sudden brightness. Then, suddenly, the light winked out. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. The air went utterly still. Tita asked, bewildered, what that bright light had been. The magic around Valerie and Rita vanished completely. Rita, barely conscious, offered a weak apology to Valerie, leaned toward him and called his name, whispered his final words, admitting he had reached his limit, then slumped unconscious into Valerie's lap, and Valerie caught him, crying out in alarm. Tita asked, her voice soft, "Are you all right?" She simply nodded. In the end, it was all thanks to Rita. Elsewhere, Nick Doe scolded Rita, telling him he needed to learn how to properly control his mana. Rita nodded and accepted the advice, and then he demonstrated a Windblade spell. Nick Doe praised the spell, likening mana to alcohol and saying that, when poured carefully, it was efficient. But pouring too much at once sent it spilling over until it vanished, leaving nothing behind. Rita agreed and smiled. Nick Dovin put on another demonstration. She cast a flame spell in her mind. Fireballs streaked out, striking several beasts, and Rita watched in amazement. She warned him, voice sharp, what would happen if he failed to control his mana. She cast the same spell again, summoning enormous fireballs and hurling them at the enemy. Panic spread, matching the terrifying scale of the spell. Just as the fireball erupted in a violent burst, enraged, Jill yelled at them, asking if they were trying to kill their own party members too. Gileiam just laughed, saying wiping out all the goblins in a single blow was impressive. Nikto turned to Rita and asked if he understood now. Rita scratched his head, sheepish but determined, and said he would try his best. Nikto's voice rang in his head, reading his thoughts and cheering him on, certain he could do it. Rita shot awake, eyes wide. It had only been a dream, and he remembered fainting after losing control of his mana and bleeding it dry, scowling in frustration that even now he still couldn't master the control they'd taught him long ago. Tita's voice called out to him, teasing that he was finally awake. Rita jerked in surprise and spun to face him, cheeks burning, and he immediately started babbling apologies for borrowing the bed. Tita reassured him it was nothing to worry about. After all, Rita was his sister's benefactor, and he added that he'd had others use detection magic on Valerie, who all confirmed the curse had truly been lifted. Relief flooded him. He smiled and said how genuinely glad he was to hear it. He asked about the girls, and Tita smiled as she said Mina and Luna were bathing with the others. Rita went blank with confusion, clearly not expecting that answer. Out in the mansion's huge outdoor bath, Valerie was guided along with gentle hands as she walked, urged to be careful since she'd only just recovered. and she thanked her older sister for her concern. Mina, wide-eyed, stared at the grand bath in amazement, remarking on how huge it was. Luna answered flatly but honestly, acknowledging it. Aisha, still in uniform, looked out of place and annoyed, wondering aloud why she had to be there too despite being in the middle of work. Still, they all stepped into the warm water. 3 of them broke into smiles, while the other 2 looked much less enthusiastic. Valerie laughed lightly and said she'd heard Aisha had once adventured with Rita, and Aisha, slightly surprised, confirmed it, while Luna's mind raced with a rising anxiety she couldn't ignore. Because besides Gabriella, even Valerie was asking about Rita, and that unsettled her. Valerie, still bright and cheerful, gushed about how wonderful the bath felt. Luna gave her usual flat reply, and Valerie added a teasing remark about how cold Luna was, laughing softly. Aisha, sensing the tension building, finally asked why Valerie had gathered them all there. Luna panicked inside, silently begging her thoughts not to let the conversation go that way. Valerie, refusing to be put off, said she wanted to hear more about Rita. Gabriella's voice was soft as she tried to talk her out of it, but Valerie openly declared it was love at first sight. And Luna, already on edge, felt a silent cry in her mind that confirmed her worst fear. She snapped, insisting Valerie was a noble, and that falling in love with a commoner like Rita was wrong. Gabriella shot back, calm and composed, explaining that Tita had even thought of giving Valerie the right to marry Rita as a reward. Luna gasped, utterly shocked. She protested again, warning that many who fell in love with their healer out of gratitude often ended up regretting it. Mina, in her innocent way, piped up that the same thing had happened to Luna as well, didn't it? Luna choked, her composure cracking. They demanded to know whose side Mina was on, but Mina only smiled and answered her debts. Valerie chuckled at the sisters' bickering, then earnestly asked them to tell her what Rita was really like. She didn't want to end up regretting her feelings. Mina didn't hesitate. She called her father a man who was kind to everyone. Aisha said Rita used to be kind, but a little flaky, and in the time she hadn't seen him, he'd clearly grown up into a much more dependable man. Luna, flustered and shy, mumbled an unsure answer, at a loss for how to describe him. Maybe kind. She didn't know. Valerie beamed after hearing their words, and declared she truly wanted to be their mother, Luna-chan and Mina-chan. Then she turned to Luna and urged that they should get along. The gaze she sent Luna, however, left no doubt. It was a declaration of war. Luna gasped, then grinned and boldly took her hand. The challenge was on, while Aisha, watching the bizarre turn of events, silently questioned how things had turned out like this. Meanwhile, back inside the mansion, Rita stretched with a contented sigh and said how wonderfully refreshed she felt, and Tita beamed, saying it was all thanks to their beloved hot spring. He shot a quick look around, felt the hush, and said the girls were probably still in the bath. Tita flashed a knowing smile and suggested they go for a drink. Rita agreed. The night had fallen, sprawled atop the Lord's mansion. 2 young girls arrived, grinning, and cheerfully announced they'd come back to their father and mother, and Tita, Gabriella, and Valerie answered together with warm welcomes as the girls' eyes widened in surprise when they saw Valerie. They burst into cheers, stunned to see her awake and looking well again. Valerie smiled and confirmed she had fully recovered. Just then the head butler Micelle gave a deliberate cough, cutting through the silence, and reminded the girls that before celebrating, they should properly greet the guests. Heartbeats racing, the girls tense and turned to face the visitors. One announced herself as Oro Amulus, the other as Nero Amulus. Tedda told Rita these were his daughters, and he said a school would open in the spring, so he was busy getting them ready for the entrance exam. Rita's eyes widened with polite amazement at the idea of a school, and she turned to the girls with a greeting of his own. Gabriella declared that with the greetings complete, it was time for dinner. They all gathered in the dining area. While they ate, Valerie gushed about the meat and held some out to Rita, who muttered an awkward thanks. Luna called out to him, scolding him for eating only meat and reminding him to eat vegetables, while a still flustered Rita gave a shy thank you as well. Valerie offered a glass of wine, noting the vegetables would make him thirsty. Rita hesitated but accepted, stammering a grateful thank you. Gabriella smiled calmly while Tito watched, a little confused. Rita and Tita locked eyes, both clearly sharing the same question. Rita, visibly unsettled, asked himself what exactly was happening, and Tita was pondering the same thing. She couldn't help murmuring to herself that the 2 girls seemed so close, and Oro and Nero agreed in unison. Valerie then cut into the meal to announce she had something to say, addressing Tita only as Isama Tita after what was. She flashed a sweet smile and said she wanted to date Rita with marriage in mind. Would that be okay? Rita froze, visibly shocked and utterly speechless. Luna slammed the table in response, her fury and indignation crackling in the air. She roared inside that Valerie had seriously crossed the line, saying that at a time like this, and she wouldn't let Valerie get ahead of her. Valerie just answered with a teasing wink. Luna, determined, pressed a hand to her face and cried out dramatically that Rita had already proposed to her, then asked if Valerie was still okay with that. Rita's jaw dropped in disbelief. He tried to backpedal, insisting he hadn't meant it as a proposal. Luna shot him an annoyed look. Valerie replied calmly, saying that with such a cute rival she wanted to ask Rita's permission. Luna gritted her teeth in fury. Tita cut in, saying he didn't mind, and asked Rita what his thoughts were. Rita, still uncomfortable, said he didn't really know much about Valerie and felt unworthy of her. He kept calling himself just a 30-year-old uncle. Valerie gasped theatrically and wailed that Rita had just rejected them, while Luna snapped that she shouldn't include her in that statement. Valerie hurriedly apologized. She hadn't meant it that way. Luna chirped that Rita was already her husband. Valerie shot back, furious that Luna was his daughter. Tita offered a compromise. They could start as friends with marriage in mind, and Rita scratched his head and awkwardly agreed to be friends. Luna shook her head. There was no need, she said. Tita echoed her and told Rita to look after Valerie, and Rita replied with a nervous stammer. Suddenly, Valerie seemed struck by a new thought and, with dramatic flair, exclaimed that something was terribly wrong. Gabriella asked if something had happened, and Valerie replied there was no problem, but mischievously added that if Rita became her friend, that would leave only Isoma lonely again. She teased with a sly grin, and Tita stood dumbfounded, shouting in protest that he would not be lonely. At last the visit came to an end. Valerie thanked Rita warmly, her words soft with gratitude. Oro and Nero cheerfully told Mina they'd see her later. Rita thanked Tita in return, his voice full of thanks for being hosted. As the carriage rolled away, Luna sat in silence while Rita smiled and stared out the window. But Luna's thoughts churned with worry. A curse. She remembered the whispers inside the organization. Dispel was almost unheard of, even among healers. Usually only priests could cast it, and it demanded huge amounts of mana and days to finish. So even if Min's unique gift had something to do with it, there was no way it could have been finished in just half a day. When he hurled that fireball, she felt it in her bones. This was his true power. Mina's voice cut through Luna's train of thought as she asked what was on her mind. And Luna turned to say she was simply thinking about how amazing their papa was. Mina's face lit up in a bright, agreeing smile. Luna hugged her tightly, telling her she was amazing too, then fell quiet and smiled as a thought stirred inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about Rita's kindness and warmth, sure that even someone like Valerie-sama would fall for him. Her gaze drifted into the distance as a quiet, weary resignation washed over her. There was nothing left for her to do. 2 days later, Valerie stood at the inn's entrance, a sweet smile on her face as she asked if Rita-sama was there. Luna, caught off guard, trembled with fury, asking herself why Valerie-sama had come. Tita, awkward and sheepish, let out a nervous laugh and explained he had simply wanted Rita to heal him, while Mina and Mirin cried out in shock at the unexpected appearance of Taida-sama. Not long after, Rita cast a healing spell on Tita's wounds, and, curiosity bright in her eyes, asked how they happened. Tita gave a sheepish laugh and said it was from a run-in with some thugs. Rita pressed on, voice edged with curiosity. Had Tita learned anything from that encounter? Tita began to answer, but a loud crash from below abruptly cut them off. A voice shouted in outrage, demanding if that was how people asked for help. Another chimed in, saying they'd heard a healer was present. A third barked, ordering them to bring the healer out. Rita, thrown off by the commotion, stared at the mention of a healer and decided to investigate. He told Tita he'd go down and see what was going on. Tita gave a short, simple reply. Rita hurried down the stairs and called to Riggs, asking if something had happened and if he'd really heard anything about a healer. But before he could answer, a cup came flying straight at him. He read it and narrowly dodged it, startled. A man roared at him, demanding to know if he was the healer and barking for him to come over at once to begin healing, while Rita, clearly unimpressed and irritated, stared at the man with open contempt and asked who he even was. Another man barked back, stunned that Rita didn't recognize Munza Salma, then announced him as Muna LG, lord of the Munza Trading Company and one of the town's most powerful figures. Riggs leaned in and muttered under his breath, "Just a corrupt merchant." Muntz barked impatiently, screaming that it hurt and burned, promising a platinum coin and demanding Rita start healing him at once. Rita replied flatly, saying they could talk about payment later, and asking him to show the injury first. With a groan of pain, Munza slowly undressed. As the last scrap of clothing fell away, his true state was laid bare. Black, charred patterns crawled over almost his entire body, and Rita froze, stunned. It wasn't just an injury, it was something else. Burn marks, yes, but not from any ordinary fire. Munzi yelled again, ordering Rita to hurry. He explained, frustrated, that he'd already called for 2 healers from the Healers Guild and they were useless. None could heal him. Was Rita no different? Rita asked, calm as ever, whether the injury had happened 2 evenings ago. One of Moon's attendants said it had, and he snapped that Rita should stop wasting time and heal his master. Rita fell silent for a moment. Thoughts swirled in his mind as he recalled what he'd read, specifically about the spell Dispel. The book warned that if you lifted a curse with Dispel, it would snap right back to the one who cast it. Rita fixed Munza with a formal, steady gaze and laid out the consequence. If the spell worked, the curse had come from him. The man courting Munza exploded in anger, spat bastard at Rita and accused him of mocking them. But before the heat could boil over, a voice rang from the stairwell. Valerie had arrived, cool and sure as she called to Munza, signaling she'd figured it out. He was the one responsible after all. Valerie stared at Munza with an icy glare. He froze in shock and shouted her name. Everyone thought the curse would have killed her. Another voice cut him off. Titus. He admitted he hadn't even known about Valerie's curse until just 2 days ago. Munza instinctively clapped a hand to his mouth, visibly shaken, and Tita's voice went grim as he said there was no point in hiding anymore. A few days earlier, his carriage had been attacked, and when the culprits were interrogated, they kept bringing up Mun's name. Valerie sneered, her voice dripping with mockery as she said Munza couldn't even talk his way out of the situation. Munza clenched his teeth and drank in the heavy silence, sizing him up. The head of a noble house, and the 3 brats, 2 of whom were from the Amulus family. He let out a dark, low chuckle, and then, without warning, Munza shouted a threat at Tita. Tita would regret coming into town without guards. He roared the order to his men. Kill everyone, except the healer. At once, armed mercenaries burst into the room, weapons drawn, charging toward them. Rita reacted calmly, chanting a spell in his mind. Chains materialized, ensnaring midair and binding the attackers tightly, freezing them in place. The spell, Chains Bind, had worked instantly, and Luna moved like a flash. She lunged forward and drove a fierce kick into Monza's face, sending him crashing into the wall with a dull thud. He staggered from the blow as Luna stood tall and remarked that the intruders were lucky. She didn't want blood spilled inside the inn. Munza, dazed and gasping, searched his men's faces for help, his voice trembling. But they only staggered where they stood, then collapsed, unconscious, to the ground. Valerie stepped forward, her eyes razor-sharp on Munza as she asked directly, why had he cursed her? For months it couldn't respond, frozen by shock and utterly speechless. Valerie slid up beside Luna, gripping her dagger and pressing its tip to Mun's throat. A thin thread of blood welled and beads of sweat rolled down his face as she commanded him to speak. Under pressure, Munza's cracked. Trembling, he admitted the truth. Valerie's proposed school was getting in the way of his business, and the trading company couldn't afford the change, he said. Luna and Valerie stared back in disbelief. Fueled by her outburst, Valerie slammed a hard, bone-jarring punch that knocked Munzo out cold. Rita cried out in surprise as Texad walked in, casually grabbing the unconscious Monza by the neck. Grinning, he said it looked like Tita hadn't needed him as a bodyguard after all, and Tita only chuckled in agreement. Text said he'd take care of locking the men up. Tita accepted, though he still had questions for Munza. Later, outside the inn, Tita turned to Rita, cheeks burning, and said she was sorry for the commotion, and Valerie, voice trembling, also apologized to Riggs for everything that had happened. Text waved at Rita and promised they'd have another drink together the next day. He gave a casual goodbye and walked away. Rita waved back and replied. He let out a long, weary sigh. Another case closed, or so it seemed. He couldn't stop wondering how Munza had gotten hold of tools that could cast curses. But in the end, he decided to leave that part of Tita alone. He turned to Mina and Luna, gently patting their heads and suggesting they head to the guild to look for quests. And Mina's eyes lit up with excitement as the 3 of them set off together toward the guild. Meanwhile, far away in the capital, Amanda Rose sat at her desk and muttered to herself, growing more and more frustrated. Amanda was out there treating people without belonging to the Healers Guild, registered only with the Adventurers Guild, and charging an absurdly low fee, and the knot of worry in her chest only tightened. She dreaded the Adventurers Guild had found the man's weak spot and was using it to grind him down, working him to the bone. She clenched her fists and vowed she would find and save him in Rita Dixon. But when she glanced at the massive pile of paperwork on her desk, her energy faltered. She slumped in her chair and sighed. First, she would have to take care of all these documents. Rita arrived at a vast mountain range, Mina and Luna at her side. He called out for Eric. Rita realized it had been about 3 weeks, and Eric answered warmly. He glanced at the time, turned to Mina and asked how she was doing. Mina answered with bright, cheerful energy, and then asked why Eric was there. Eric explained his corporation would handle the transportation of the Black Dragon. Rita found that reasonable and gave a curt wave from nearby. Then suddenly a stern voice cut through the greetings as Rang, the branch chief of the Adventurer Guild's Amulus branch, reminded them that the time had come. Rita acknowledged the prompt and began to cast a spell in silence. At the command, "Open," the Black Dragon's lifeless body suddenly lay on the ground before them. Luna stood frozen, awestruck and rooted to the spot. Tex chuckled. "It's been a decade since I've seen a drag that large," he said. Gabriella gaped in amazement while Tita muttered in disbelief at the beast's sheer scale. An A-class storage clerk from the kingdom stepped forward, announced the start of his spell, and made the Black Dragon vanish from sight. He grinned and confirmed the dragon was now stowed. Rita nodded in agreement, handing over responsibility. Claus remarked that they were relying on the clerk now. Rang, a little flustered, apologized to Claus for his earlier plan. He'd only meant to pay after inspecting the dragon, but Claus brushed it off, saying it was fine. If the dragon sold well at auction, everyone would benefit, and Rang should feel grateful, which Rang admitted he was glad about. Valerie ran up and wrapped Rita in a tight hug, eyes wide with admiration, exclaiming how incredible it was that he had defeated the dragon. Shocked, Luna raced to Rita and hugged him tight, calling out to Valerie. Then smirking, she asked, "Aren't you embarrassed to be hugging a man in public?" Valerie snapped back, pointing out Luna's hypocrisy. The two clung to Rita even tighter, drawing a shout of protest from him. Embarrassed, he yelled at them to stop. It was too much, and everyone's eyes were fixed on them. Valerie and Luna turned toward each other, their eyes meeting and locking in a charged, wordless moment. Slowly, the same smirk crept across both their faces. Then, in perfect unison, they cried out, "Let them watch!" Rita flushed fiercely and shouted again, exasperated. He couldn't believe how well they got along, and, in a way, he thought it was a good thing. Eric cleared his throat and cut in, asking for a moment, which Rita welcomed at once, eager for the distraction. Mina turned to them and urged Valerie and Luna to let go, saying their behavior was troubling her dad. Rita scratched his head, cheeks still flushed, and asked Eric what he wanted to discuss. Eric explained that someone had traveled with their group from the capital. Everything pointed to this person doing business with Rita and being tied to the Healer Guild. A faint ripple of unease passed over Rita's face. Mina's eyes lit with curiosity as she asked about the Healer Guild, and Valerie replied that it was the group that brought healers together and kept them organized. Millet suddenly cut in, snapping that she already knew what they'd say. They'd demand Rita leave the Adventure Guild, join the Healer Guild, and raise treatment prices absurdly high. Millet turned to Rita with concern, and asked if he was going to quit being an adventurer. Rita immediately denied it. He had no intention of quitting. Millet planted herself behind him, fierce as a storm, insisting that if anyone from the Healer Guild came pushing, Rita should just drive them off. Rita let out an awkward laugh after her fiery suggestion. Eric said the convoy looked unusually impressive, and Rita agreed, her voice tight as she pointed out that troubling incidents had been on the rise lately. Eric explained that because they needed transport help, they'd borrowed support from the Commerce Guild in the capital, and Reed smiled and nodded, clearly understanding the situation. Eric then mentioned he had another business meeting nearby and wouldn't be returning to the capital for now, telling Rita to contact him if anything came up. Rita thanked him sincerely. After that, they made their way back toward town, and along the way, Klaus noticed Mina was Luna's sister, to which Rita gave a short, quiet confirmation. He swung the question back to Klaus, asking what he planned to do while they waited for the auction results, and Klaus replied he'd be staying in Amulets from now on, making Rita stare in surprise as he added that Edith and Kate would be arriving in a few days. Then he lowered his voice and said Hilda would be joining them as well, and at the name his eyes went wide. He paused, remembering Luna and Valerie. He told Rita he was looking forward to things. Rita, suddenly uneasy, forced out a nervous reply. Klaus grinned, waved, and wished him luck before walking off. Rita returned the wave, but she was clearly rattled. Anxious thoughts swirled in his head. Was Hilda really serious back then? He'd assumed soon meant 10, maybe even 20 years later. He was already barely keeping up with Luna and Valori-sama, and now Hilda too? Suddenly, Luna asked where Klaus had gone. Rita flinched, blurting out that he had already left. He thought to himself that if Luna and Hilda were to meet, it wouldn't end well. Dread swelled inside him as he pictured the outcome. Mina saw he was in trouble, looked up at him with worried eyes and asked what was wrong, even pointing out how drenched in sweat he was. But Rita just brushed it off and said it was nothing. He drew a deep, steady breath and shoved the thoughts aside, telling himself to stop worrying. Meanwhile, at the Nevin clinic, tension hung thick as a voice shouted in anger. It was painfully clear their business was dying because of that man. The one shouting was Nexon Crow, Amulus's resident healer, and all around him the clinic's beds stood empty. A woman asked about the other healer in town, Yuri Temperance, and Yuri answered by simply shaking his head. She mumbled, "I'm bored. I can't even use my healing magic." He added that she was strange in her own way, a person who felt pure joy simply from using her healing skills. He handed a sheet of paper to the woman and gestured for her to look. It was the Adventure Guild's price list. The woman read it and gasped, shock washing over her. The prices were shockingly low. Only 5 silver coins, the same as common potions. She fell into a heavy silence. Her expression changed. She'd made up her mind. She gave her name, Amanda Rowe, and vowed to make the guild rethink their prices. No, she wouldn't stop there. She'd go herself, set Rita Dixon straight, and drag him into their glorious healer guild. The next day at the Adventure Guild, the conference room buzzed with a meeting, and a clear voice cut through the hum to move the agenda onto the next topic. Morelia announced that, now that the months of corporation were dissolved, the vacant land could be used to build a medical center. Text put it bluntly. Did they have the budget to support a project like this? Morelia hesitated, but Eric spoke up, his voice cutting through the room as he said the Merchant Guild would cover the costs for them, and Michelle added that Amulus SA had kicked in extra funding as well. Tex smiled, convinced there would be no money problems. Just then the door burst open and Amanda barreled in, shouting that there was a big problem. She'd heard there was a meeting and demanded, "Who is Rita Dixon?" Tex told her Rita wasn't there. Morelia, annoyed by the interruption, snapped, "Who are you?" He bluntly reminded her that only town officials were allowed in the meeting room, and Amanda announced that she was a representative of the Healer Guild. Rang demanded to know her purpose. What business did the Healer Guild have with them? Amanda hesitated for a heartbeat, then pushed out her words. She was there on behalf of the guild, opposing the building of a clinic for what she called a rogue healer. Text calmly asked if she was opposing it, even though the town lord had approved the project, and Amanda answered confidently. "Yes, of course. This town already has 2 guild-affiliated healers, and I won't let this kind of disrespect go unchallenged." Amanda's tirade rolled on, lashing out with more accusations as she said the town was exploiting Rita Dixon, forcing him to work for meager pay. Morelia sprang up to defend her, eyes blazing. "Rita is my family and a benefactor to this town," she declared, flatly rejecting Amanda's accusation and warning her to keep her jokes within reason. Amanda fired back, furious, arguing Rita's price was the same as a potion. To her, that was plain exploitation. Morelia calmly pointed out that Rita was an adventurer, that his healing services were funded through quests, and he was satisfied with the compensation. Amanda, still smug, said it was only because he didn't understand the value of proper healer guild services, and Morelia narrowed her eyes and shot back. "Didn't know?" She scoffed, saying the healer guild was infamous for charging massive fees while calling them donations. What more was there to know? Amanda flinched at the accusation and lashed out, demanding to know what Morelia had just said. She shouted that if she wanted, she could even take away Rita's right to call himself a healer. Moreia's voice rose again. A healer? That title meant nothing to her. Rita didn't heal people because he was a healer. He healed them because he was Rita's son. That was what mattered. Their eyes locked in fury, the room pulsed with raw, hostile tension. Rang suddenly barked at Morelia to calm down, and Morelia immediately apologized, blurting out, "Gil Master." Rang turned to Amanda, confirmed her name with a cold edge, and asked bluntly if it wasn't time she left the room, and Amanda shouted in protest. She wasn't finished speaking, but Rang stayed calm, reminding her this was an official meeting of the town's guild branch. The Healer Guild didn't even have a branch here and had no authority, and Amanda trembled, stunned by the dismissal. Rang repeated, her voice like iron, that she had no say in the matter. Amanda's face twisted in rage. Rang held out one last option. If she was still dissatisfied, she could take it up with the town's lord, or even bring it before Rita himself. Amanda shouted that she'd do exactly that and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The moment she was gone, Morelia mischievously stuck out her tongue. Meanwhile, at the far end, Luna was talking to Rita. She answered his earlier question about the organization. It was called Crimson Topaz. She tilted her head, puzzled, and asked why he would suddenly ask something like that. Rita said he only wanted to be cautious. Better to know about possible threats. Luna's eyes widened for a beat in surprise, then softened, and she thanked him for worrying about her and Mina. Her eyes danced with mischief as she suddenly offered a reward. "How about a kiss on the lips?" Red moved aside and told her not to tease him, and Luna snapped back, irritated, insisting she wasn't teasing. Suddenly, a loud voice thundered from outside. "Rita Dixon!" Rita stiffened slightly, a cold wave of unease washing over him. He peeked outside and saw Amanda planted defiantly in front of the inn, bold and unmoving, clearly ready for a confrontation. In the end, Amanda planted her feet, squared her shoulders, and boldly declared her intentions. She blurted it out. Rita Dixon should quit the Adventure Guild and join their prestigious Healer Guild instead. Rita met her with a calm smile and respectfully declined her offer. Amanda's voice cracked with frustration as she demanded to know why, accusing not just the Adventure Guild, but the whole town of exploiting him, making him work for next to nothing and taking advantage of his skills. To her, they were using him, while nearby Mirren peered in and asked if they were fighting, and Riggs shot back that it wasn't quite like that. Rita scratched his head, deep in thought. He admitted that from Amanda's point of view, it might seem that way, but he stressed that the Healer Guild's outrageously high prices could only be paid by nobles and wealthy merchants. He wanted to use his healing gift to help the people who really lived in the town, helping adventurers and ordinary folk alike. He then told Amanda that the conversation was over. There was no need for her to come again. Amanda, shocked, demanded, "Nobody had just said that." She insisted everything she was doing was for his sake. Suddenly, Luna slipped up behind her and drove a sharp strike into the nape of Amanda's neck. Amanda collapsed in a heap, out cold on the floor. Luna, irritated, muttered that Amanda was wasting her precious time with her papa by ranting on and on. Rita was caught off guard and let out a surprised cry when she saw Luna. Without missing a beat, Luna seized Amanda by the collar and hauled her toward the door. And Tex, who had just arrived, flinched at the sight of Luna and muttered that he was too late, even though he'd left the meeting early to get there. Luna's voice was ice cold as she assured him Amanda was still alive. She handed Amanda off to Tex, saying he'd arrived at the perfect time and ordering him to dump her somewhere, and Tex didn't fight it. He agreed. Mina and Mirren stood a short distance away, frozen like statues, unable to believe what they'd just seen. Suddenly a furious voice cut through the air again. Amanda had regained consciousness and was shouting in disbelief. She couldn't accept what had just happened. She wailed that instead of listening to reason, they had turned to violence, and she screamed that Rita was nothing but an adventurer, a barbarian, unfit to call himself a healer. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached for a mug of beer, downed it in one hard gulp, and slammed it onto the table, declaring that if this was how things were going to be, then she would take action and would formally strip Rita of the right to call himself a healer. She said she had to return to the capital and start getting ready. The next carriage wouldn't leave until the day after tomorrow. Later that night, laughter spilled into every corner of the room. Tita chuckled, eyes soft, and said how much Rita had been through lately. They read it, let out an awkward laugh, and asked for some mercy. Tita watched how everyone lived by their own idea of justice, and how that often led to trouble. Ask for a big fee every few days or a small one every day, and the total money you got hardly changed. Valerie added that even so, the healers in this town had already made treatment far more affordable than what people paid in the capital. Luna murmured, voice low and steady, that no matter what guild Rita belonged to, her one job was to stand by him as his wife. Valerie cut in, her voice laced with sarcasm as she made it clear she meant as a daughter. Luna laughed with a forced cheer, corrected herself, and said she supported him as a friend. Then Valerie added Salma with a teasing edge. They traded fake smiles and polite laughs, each hiding the rivalry simmering between them. Mina and Mirren watched, eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Mirren commented that they seemed to be getting along, and it nodded happily in agreement. Suddenly Tita shifted the mood, saying to set all that aside. There was something more important to discuss, and Munza and Rita immediately grew serious and acknowledged him. Tita blurted that he'd found the source of the curse Munza had used, and the clues pointed straight to a group called Crimson Topaz that had sold the cursed tool. The instant the name was spoken, Luna and Rita froze, faces paling and eyes wide, clearly shaken. Valerie, sharp-eyed, saw Luna's hands shaking, clenched into tight fists, and asked if they knew anything about the name. Rita and Luna locked eyes, sharing a solemn look. Luna let out a long sigh, then, voice barely a whisper, admitted that they did. She then began to speak, telling every single thing she knew. And when Luna finished her explanation, the room slipped into a quiet, thoughtful hush. At last, Tita broke it, a soft murmur of acknowledgement slipping from her. He decided to pass the information to the Adventurer Guild, and make it something the kingdom itself would have to deal with. He turned to Rita and asked if that would be all right, and Rita nodded. He said it sounded like the right move and shot a quick look at Luna, searching for her confirmation. Luna agreed. She added that Crimson Topaz probably had several hideouts and offered to hand over a list of every place she'd visited. Tita thanked her with a warm, grateful smile. The meeting soon wrapped up, and Titus stood to thank Riggs for the food. Riggs replied warmly, saying Tidu-sama and Valerie-sama were welcome anytime and would be well fed with both food and drink, and Tidu responded that he'd gladly take him up on that. While the others started to relax, Valerie slipped into a sudden deep hush of thought. Without warning, she called to Mina and Luna, beckoning them over. Luna answered suspiciously, her voice sharp as she asked what she wanted. Valerie said nothing at first, simply pulling them both into a tight embrace as she laughed cheerfully. Luna gave a startled cry, clearly caught off guard. Valerie kept giggling, squeezing them with surprising strength. At last they wriggled free, and Mina and Luna both gasped for breath. Annoyed, Luna snapped, demanding to know what that was about. Valerie stepped forward again, her face softening. She leaned in, voice barely more than a whisper, told Luna not to worry. They'd make those responsible pay. Luna's eyes widened at the sudden promise, and Valerie stared back with pain, warmth, and quiet determination before breaking into a gentle smile. Then she asked sweetly, "Okay?" Luna stared for a moment, then smiled, returned the smile, and gave a firm yes. In the next breath, she suddenly declared that this moment was special, and for just this once she would allow Valerie-sama to hug her papa, read it, and turn toward them in shock. Valerie's face lit up with excitement. She cried his name in delight and launched herself at him. Rita, caught totally off guard, let out a sharp, surprised cry and stumbled back as panic washed over her. Luna then called for Mina and Miran, and the two girls rushed in, giggling with joy as they joined Valerie in enveloping Rita in a sudden group hug. Redis stood there, flustered in the middle of everything, swept up in their affection. Elsewhere, deep within a forest path, two women walked side by side, their footsteps swallowed by the hush of the trees. "Eat it. Let it be your way of saying sorry for making them take a detour." Hilda, calm though unsure if she should worry, asked if this was the only place the herb Edith needed could be found. Inside the covered wagon behind them, Kate slept soundly, her breath soft and steady, completely undisturbed. Hilda chuckled at the sight, saying children were simply too adorable, and Edith watched her with a fond smile and agreed. Out of the blue, Hilda blurted that she wanted to have a child with Rita someday, and Edith froze, startled. Hilda turned to her, annoyed, asked what that look meant, and Edith quickly said she wasn't thinking anything. Hilda wasn't convinced. She grumbled that she probably looked too much like Kate, and that Edith was likely thinking it ridiculous for someone who looked like a child to talk about having one. Edith gave an awkward laugh and insisted she wasn't thinking that at all. Yet Hilda's irritation still hung in the air. Something unexpected caught her attention. In the distance, she saw a wagon off the road, and she told Edith to stay back and not to wait for Kate. Then she crept up to the scene, careful with every step. She swept her gaze across the area. No monsters were in sight, and not a single human was around. As she drew nearer, the overturned wagon loomed into view, and with it, the bodies. The coachman and guards were sprawled lifeless on the ground. It didn't look like the work of monsters, but her instincts told her otherwise as she peered inside the wagon. Their two bodies lay locked in a final embrace, cold and dead. She asked herself if bandits had done it. At that very moment, a scrap of paper fluttered down and landed at her feet. He bent down, picked it up, and held it close, eyes narrowing as he inspected every inch. Inside the bustling halls of the capital's adventure guild, Rita rifled through the request board when a woman nearby called his name and asked if he had found any postings, and Rita, scratching his head, admitted he hadn't seen any looking for rear guards. Suddenly, a man stepped up and asked if he was looking to join a party. He read it, turned, and confirmed it. The man eyed him up and down, taking in his look and deciding he was a rear guard. Rita said he could use an item box the size of a backpack and knew a bit of fire magic. A spark of curiosity flickered across his face. He introduced himself as Jill, said he was putting together a party called the Jet Black Wolves, asked Rita if he wanted in, and watched Rita light up with excitement as he accepted the offer and introduced himself in return. Another man stepped forward and introduced himself as Gileiam. The girl beside him gave her name as Nikto, and a nearby woman who had been watching said it was good for Rita. Jill turned to her with a puzzled, questioning look, asking who she was since she clearly wasn't an adventurer. The woman simply smiled and introduced herself as Rincer. She said she'd just started working at the Dancing Dragon Princess Bar, grabbed Rita's arm and begged him to look after him. Later in a forest, the group works together, gathering materials. Once they finished, Rita activated his item box and slid the gathered goods inside. When he finished the process, he saw Gileiam wincing, doubled over in pain. Nikto asked if he'd twisted his ankle, then stepped over and offered to take a look. He examined the wound, then silently cast a healing spell. A faint glow rose from his hands. The spell left Gileiam stunned. Nikto gasped too, amazed that Rita could now use healing magic, and Rita replied that he had just learned it recently. Gileiam praised him, marveling at how rare healers were. He gave a small laugh and modestly said he couldn't even mend minor wounds with it yet. Gileiam rubbed his shoulder and said even a little pain relief was enough, and Jill added that it was no different from using pain-killing herbs. Give her time, and Rita would likely be able to heal cuts too. Then Jill suddenly grew serious and warned Rita not to let anyone else know he could use healing magic. Rita blinked, clearly confused. Jill grinned as she explained that if the Healer Guild found out, they might force Rita to quit being an adventurer. Reed scratched his head as understanding hit him, and Jill said it would definitely be trouble. Now Mina shook Rita awake, calling for him to get out of bed. It was already morning, but still half asleep, he mumbled that getting up would be such a bother. Mina, exasperated, snapped, "I'm the one in trouble, not you." Rita opened his eyes slowly and yawned. Saying he'd had a nostalgic dream was just an excuse to scold him for oversleeping. Someone then accused him of staying up drinking too late again, and Rita let out a sheepish chuckle and apologized, trying to smile but ending with a soft, "It's okay." She ran outside, shouting to her sister that their dad was finally awake, while he sat up, telling himself it was time to go to the guild and check the quest board. Later, at the Amulet branch of the Adventure Guild, Rita and Mina stepped inside and froze when they spotted some familiar faces. "Read it!" called out to them. It was Edith and her son Kate. When she heard their names, Kate raced over to Mina, beaming and crying out, "It's been so long!" Edith smiled, greeting Rita warmly. Luna watched anxiously and asked who Edith was, and Rita explained their Claus's family. Edith announced herself calmly as Claus's wife and presented Kate as their son. Luna followed, introducing herself as Mina's sister and Rita Dixon's wife, and her words hung heavy in the air. At that moment, another voice joined the conversation. Hilda had appeared behind them and echoed the word wife with amusing curiosity, then said, "What a coincidence." Rita flinched, sweat beading on his forehead, and slowly, nervously turned to face her. Hilda smiled and introduced herself as Hilda Garda Edera, even adding that she too was Rita's wife. Mina greeted her cheerfully, calling her one Ichon, and Luna exploded with rage, whirling on Rita and demanding an explanation for what the little elf girl had said, while Rita stood frozen, unable to speak. Hilda smirked and asked, smugly, if Luna was calling her a little girl, pointing out that she was older than even Edith despite her youthful appearance. Luna ignored her words and yelled at Rita again, asking if she couldn't kill that thing. She insisted she should be allowed to. Hilda simply grinned and said that dealing with a child's tantrums was an adult's duty. Luna's fury boiled over. She flashed behind Hilda in a blink and proudly declared herself a full-grown adult. Without turning, Hilda casually caught Luna's attacking arm, and Luna froze in surprise. At the guild, Hilda smirked and said, "Not bad," about Luna's move. She hoisted Luna up, primed to throw her. Then Luna vanished in mid-motion. She popped up in front of Hilda, a smirk of her own curling as she returned the compliment. Their eyes locked, daring each other. In an instant they spring at each other, determination blazing as they shout that whoever wins will be the wife. A crowd formed around the sudden confrontation, and Kate watched nervously as they circled one another like fighters. A voice from within the gathering sneered, wishing the midgets good luck, and Luna and Hilda snapped back at once, shouting they were not midgets. Still grinning, Hilda said she might try being a little more serious now. Luna, undaunted, promised to show her exactly what she could do. Suddenly, Millet crashed in, shouting in frustration, demanding to know what all the commotion was and begging them to stop making a scene inside the guild. Before she could continue, a boot came flying and slammed into her. Every week she begged them not to throw things. Overwhelmed, Rita snapped and yelled at them both to stop. A calm voice cut through the noise. Valerie stepped in and told him to leave them alone. They were having fun. Rita spun around, stunned. Valerie-sama, why was she here? Valerie explained she'd heard merchant groups had been attacked near the town, so she'd come as her brother's representative. A gasp broke out. That was no small matter. Meanwhile, as the scene boiled over, someone yelled at him, demanding to know who that woman was, and Luna, stunned to see Valerie, shouted in turn. Valerie stared at Rita for a long moment, a slow smirk creeping over her face. Then she turned to Hilda, and with polite ease introduced herself, saying she'd heard about her from Klaus. She declared, "I'm Valerie, Rita-sama's wife." Rita froze, stunned again. Valerie-sama. Hilda's mouth dropped open in disbelief. Luna whirled to Mina, panic choking her voice as she demanded, "Say something!" Hilda begged too, pleading for Mina's backing. She was the real wife, wasn't she? Valerie smiled sweetly and said she thought she could be a good mother to Mina. She giggled, and Edith, watching it all unfold, chuckled and said, "Oh my." Valerie turned to Mina with gentle eyes and called her name. Mina fell silent, sinking into deep thought. Rita stood nearby, drenched in sweat, silently begging Mina not to say anything that would make things worse. After a few seconds of silence, Mina looked up and said that her dad had saved every one of them, and they all loved him. She added that having lots of moms made her happy, and she giggled, sincere and warm. Far away, a group of men closed in around a few captives, women and children among them. One of them pointed out there were 5 people, women and children included, and Amanda sat tense among the prisoners. One man asked the other, "Have you seen those kids?" Amanda's eyes were glued to the picture in his hand. She muttered aloud, "Weren't those the ones with Rita Dixon?" And the man snapped at her, demanding to know what she'd said. Amanda told them what she knew, and their leader leaned in, eyes gleaming with interest. He muttered, voice small and raw, that Rita and the 2 children were in Amulets. He barked a sharp order, shouted to Gileiam, and told him to tell everyone. When the adventurers left town to investigate the merchant attacks, they would strike the Amulets as planned, and the attack should begin 1 hour after their departure. Gileiam gave a sharp nod to the order and left the room. Amanda shouted quickly. The leader looked back, trembling, and she pleaded. She'd told them everything she knew, so please, let them go. She added with a hopeful lilt that even this would benefit the Healer Guild. Without a word, the leader's kick slammed into Amanda, sending her crashing to the floor. She gasped, the pain stealing her breath. Trembling and desperate, she asked, "What was he?" The leader sneered, contempt curling his lips. He was a favorite of the Healer Guild. He turned to the others and laughed. "Every person in this room was nursing a grudge against the Healer Guild," he said. Amanda's eyes widened in horror as the man turned, gave one last order, and told the others to warm up on this woman. He slipped out of the room, and the other men closed in on Amanda. Their smiles were twisted with dark intent, and Amanda trembled in terror as tears streamed down her face while she muttered, helpless, for someone, anyone, to save her. Her scream rolled through the building. Outside, the leader chuckled to himself, his mood twisted and triumphant. Luck was on his side, and everything he wanted was gathered in the very town they planned to attack. He pulled back his hood to show his face to Jill, and with a wicked grin he promised, "Just wait, Rita." He'd burn the amulets to the ground. He wanted to see Rita's face twist in despair and couldn't wait. Outside the town of Amulus, Jill stood before his gathered men and confirmed that the adventurers had already set out on their patrol. He turned to the troops and addressed them, heart racing. This was the moment. The Black Wolves would now spring their plan into action, and he warned that when the adventurers saw the prepared carriage, they would almost certainly head for the abandoned village to the south. Cheers erupted from the gathered men, and another man shouted back, full of excitement, that their targets would almost certainly follow the trails they'd laid out. Jill confirmed it precisely. That meant the adventurers wouldn't return to Amulus until the next morning. In that gap, with only 150 men, they'd attack and burn down the town of Amulus, and he traced the path they would take next. Once they lent a hand to the neighboring countries, they'd be hailed as mercenaries instead of written off as mere bandits. And at last they would rise to the rank of knights. He rallied them, lifting them out of their miserable lives. Gileiam roared, urging his comrades to unleash the Black Wolves' power. With one last war cry, Jill commanded them to march. Meanwhile, inside the healing wing of the Adventurers Guild, Rita had just finished tending to a patient. The man thanked him, saying he could return to work the next day, and Rita smiled and gave his encouragement. She waved the man off as he left, calling out a cheerful farewell. Rita finally called an end to the day's healing work. Malay came over and praised him for his hard work. She noticed Mina and the others weren't with him. Rita said they'd stayed to help at the end and were showing Hilda around town. Malay laughed awkwardly, saying she really wanted everyone to get along. Rita blushed so hard she could hardly speak. She just scratched his head and mumbled an apology, and Malay reassured him it was fine. He said the scouting party would be back the next day and things might get hectic, so he planned to rest early. Just then a girl approached and called out, "Are you Rita Dixon?" Rita turned and confirmed it, asking who she was. The girl introduced herself as Yuri Temperance, a healer from the town. Rita asked if she needed anything from him. Yuri said she'd heard he was the one who healed Valerie Sama and asked if it was true. He read it and confirmed it. Yuri paused. She admitted she'd tried to heal Valerie herself but failed and wanted to know how he did it. Rita hesitated briefly. He told her it was through detect and dispel. Yuri let out a soft, amazed murmur and asked if it was because he was an adventurer. She mumbled that his healing was extraordinary, then shrugged vaguely and said, "Yeah, let's go with that." Rita blinked at her, clearly puzzled. Yuri met him with a steady, unblinking stare. Then suddenly a request burst out. She wanted to become his disciple. Rita stood there, stunned. Yuri said, almost in a whisper, that no patients were coming anymore and she hadn't even been able to use her healing lately, and Rita, bewildered, blurted out, "She can't even use her healing?" Yuri went on, saying she'd heard the guild planned to open a clinic, and Rita agreed. She then said that if she worked with him, she could get the chance to use her healing again, admitting she truly loved magic, especially healing, and that it made her happy to help people recover from injuries. which made Rita think to himself that she was a little strange. Yuri said that's why she wanted to transfer to the Adventurers Guild and become his disciple. She asked him in a formal voice to take care of her and even called him master. Rita shouted in shock. He gave an awkward smile and told her his hands were already full, and he wasn't planning to take on any disciples. Yuri fell silent, his brow furrowing as he searched for another idea. After a beat, she suddenly declared that if offering her body would make her his disciple, she was okay with it. Rita nearly choked, and he shouted for her to stop, insisting it wasn't necessary. Then, panicked and flustered, suggested they simply work together as colleagues. Yuri nodded calmly but kept calling him master, saying she'd go to the Adventurers Guild. A stopper read that he'd come along, and he felt worried. He asked, voice soft, that since they'd only be co-workers, could she please stop calling him master? Yuri replied with a quick understood, and Rita awkwardly smiled, relieved she finally seemed to get it. But Yuri then said she'd work so hard she'd eventually be recognized as his disciple, even a master, and Rita muttered in despair that she still didn't get it after all. Then he snaps around at a sharp sound nearby. 2 bright flares shot up into the sky and burst apart. Rita recoiled in surprise and demanded to know what was happening, while Yuri let out a sharp gasp when she recognized them as emergency signal flares. She pointed out that they were coming not only from the east, but also from the south, and Rita's voice trembled with tension as he asked what was going on. Meanwhile at the market, Hilda tilted her head, confused. Was this a festival? 2 flares burst again in the sky. Mina muttered that they were signal flares, and Luna fell into a serious silence. A nearby old woman cried out, recognizing them as emergency signals, while a man shouted for people to seek shelter indoors immediately. With a warm smile, the old woman offered the girls shelter in her house if their home was too far away. Luna smiled and politely declined, saying they would go back. Mina relayed Moran Sean's worry that he was watching the inn alone and urged them to hurry, while Hilda thanked the old woman for her kindness. The old lady called after them, "Be careful!" As the 3 girls walked the streets, the place lies eerily deserted. Mina looked around, nerves on edge, and asked what was going on. Luna muttered something about the sound of swords, maybe bandits. They lit up with curiosity, asking excitedly if human towns were normally attacked like this. Luna snapped that, of course, they weren't. Suddenly, Hilda's elven ears twitched, and she warned the others that the path ahead wasn't safe. Luna, bored but focused, muttered that a group of bandits was approaching from the left. Mina's stomach dropped. If they didn't take that route, they wouldn't make a home. Hildak nodded, and Lunar agreed. There was simply no other choice. They'd barely turned the corner when a group of armed men stepped out and blocked their path. A man stepped forward, a sleazy grin curling his lips as he sneered that they'd caught 3 little breaths. He chuckled darkly again, saying the girls' faces would fetch a high price, then sneered that since they couldn't escape, they might as well be kidnapped outright. Luna stepped forward, calm and steady, and told him to get out of the way. Papa was waiting at home, but the man grinned and said, "Too bad. You won't be seeing your papa again." Hilda chimed in coldly, saying they should step aside. If they did, she might let them live. Mina anxiously called to her older sisters. One of the bandits scoffed, clearly amused that Hilda was still coming closer. He said he liked her confidence and laughed. Another man moved in on Luna, taunting her that she was trembling, and reached out, but he never got to touch her. Luna's dagger sliced clean through the air. Blood splattered across the nearby wall. The man screamed. His arms had been cleanly severed and now lay on the ground. He collapsed in agony. Luna stepped on his head and coldly reminded him. She had warned him to move. On the other side, Hilda whispered a spell, and the seeds in her palm burst to life, turning the dare into a bow and arrows. The bandits choked on a gasp of confusion and horror as they realized what was happening. He let loose 2 arrows with deadly precision, and each one pierced a man's skull. The last bandit screamed, spun to run, shouting in terror about the monstrous brats, when an arrow suddenly struck the back of his head, and a dagger instantly followed, slicing his throat. Luna and Hilda, both bristling with irritation, muttered in unison about how annoying the whole situation was. They turned to Mina and told her to go, and she met them with a steady, determined, "Yes," and the 3 of them tore off toward the end. Mina admitted she was worried about Rita, and Hilda quickly reassured her that Rita could handle herself. As they rounded the corner, someone cried out, "I can see the end!" Up ahead, a girl burst into view, running for her life and screaming, "Help! Bandits! They're right behind me!" Luna narrowed her eyes sharply. On Hilda's side, a man was being chased too, and he didn't even have to call out the 2 split directions. Luna cried she'd take the right, while Hilda shouted back she'd take the left. Hilda then told Mina to head to the inn ahead of him, and Mina shouted back, "Yes!" and told him to be careful. Luna Grand put on a calm smile and told her not to worry. They'd deal with this fast. Luna was left to fight the bandits. Hilda stayed back, firing arrows with quick, precise aim. Frustrated, she complained about what a bother it was, then called out that there was someone in the alley too, and Mina sprinted ahead and reached the end. She flung the door open and cried, "Dad, Mir and Sean, are they okay?" She froze in shock. Miram lay on the floor, tied up and surrounded by a group of armed men. Slowly turning to face Mina, Mirren called out to her, tears choking her voice. Mina's breath snagged as Jill stepped out of the shadows and muttered, cold as ice, "They caught one." Min's eyes went wide with horror. Jill smirked cruelly as he let a single piece of paper float to the ground. Luna and Hilda rushed into the inn, breathless, then stood rooted to the spot, stunned by the sight that met their eyes. Jill stood there, smug as anything, while behind him 2 men held Mina and Mirren hostage, blades pressed to their throats. Luna and Hilda panicked and tried to move, but Jill stopped them dead with a cold warning. Any movement or use of magic and the girls would die. He gave the signal to proceed, and the female spellcaster beside him answered with quiet certainty, weaving her spell in complete silence. Sleep magic. The spell took hold instantly, and clouds swirled around Luna and Hilda as they inhaled sharply. As their consciousness faded, Hilda murmured an apology to Rita, and Luna too whispered an apology to her father as the two collapsed together. Jill chuckled wickedly at the success of his plan. He declared everything was going according to plan, announced they would take the girls and leave Amulus immediately, and his men responded in agreement. Outside the inn, Aisha, worried, asked if something had happened, and Elliot replied grimly that bandits were attacking from the east and south where the walls were still unfinished and were even closing in on the main gate, while Tex, troubled, muttered in exasperation. Suddenly, Elliot spotted them. A bandaged group huddled in front of the main gate. Gileiam turned to his men and barked the order to scatter, loot, and burn the town. Elliot stepped forward to stop him, challenging his intent, and Gileiam sneered, asking if they were even adventurers. But Tex cut him off. They were vigilantes, the town's defenders. Gileiam, bored and unmoved, shrugs it off and orders their death regardless. Aisha recognized Gileiam and froze, shocked by what he'd done. She wondered how someone like him could stoop so low. When her eyes met his, Gileiam acknowledged her with a smirk. Aisha couldn't understand why someone who'd once been abandoned, yet still kept their honor, would follow Jill this far. Gileiam's voice was ice cold. He didn't need a reason. He was perfectly fine following Jill wherever he went, and Aisha could only whisper, stunned and in disbelief. Gileiam rallied his men, declaring that Jill had, through his charisma, gathered the once scattered bandits into one united force. Together they'd burn the town to prove their power. They would black wolves, and they'd leave their mark. "Let us command the bandits' charge!" Text pleaded with Aisha, Elliot, and the others to go after them, volunteering to stay behind and face Gileiam himself. Aisha protested, her voice tight as she reminded them Gileiam had once been a C-rank adventurer. But Elliot insisted, and with a reluctant sigh she agreed. Before she left, she glanced back and, torn by mixed feelings, said goodbye to Gileiam. Then she and the others surged after the bandits, leaving Text alone, and Gileiam sneered at Texas's attempt to face him alone. Text sneered at the Black Wolves' attire and mocked their camaraderie, then grabbed his shovel, smirked, utterly unfazed, and dared them to bring it on. Elsewhere at the Adventurers Guild, someone shouted, "Bandits!" and Rita looked up in alarm. Melee had no details, only that many bandits had poured into town and signal flares were going up everywhere. Yuri turned to her master and asked what he planned to do. Rita said he was worried about his family and would return to the inn. Yuri said she'd tend to the injured arriving at the guild. Malay protested sharply, insisting the guild couldn't cover the healer's fees. Yuri brushed off their worry, saying she'd treat them like part of a quest just like her master. Then she looked to Rita for confirmation, and he gave an awkward smile, while Malay, confused, asked about the master bit, but Rita just brushed it aside. They thrust the guild into Yuri's care and bolted out. Rita pushed on, telling himself Luna and Hilda could handle things, but he was still in a hurry. Suddenly, a man's scream for help tore through the air as bandits chased him. Rita realized they had already reached this area. He called out to the man to duck, and silently casting a spell, he invoked the spirit of the wind. An invisible blade formed and sliced through the bandits. Blood sprayed as they hit the ground. The man on the ground trembled with fear. Rita let out a relieved breath. He hadn't damaged a single building with his magic. He then moved closer to see if the man was hurt, and the man, clearly relieved, thanked him. And then she recognized him as Rita Dixon. Surprised, Rita asked if he knew him. The man introduced himself, Nexon Crow, a healer from the town. He kept saying he had so many questions for Rita, but she refused to talk right now, insisting he get back to the inn and urging Nexon to evacuate as well. Instead, Nexon clung to Rita, begging her not to leave him behind. If the bandits found him again, they'd kill him. He shoved his exhaustion aside, agreed, and decided to bring Nexon with him as he went back to the end. At the main gate, a harsh message stared down at the bandits, offering a brutal choice: surrender, die fighting, or die running. He grinned and told them to choose, and Gileiam sneered, throwing in a darker option: his death. With a roar, he lunged forward, swinging his broadsword. But Tex stayed calm and blocked it with a shovel. Gileiam gasped in disbelief as the Tex corrected him. He was wrong, and they launched a counterattack. The shovel moved with lightning speed, and Gileiam clenched his teeth, trying to react, but it was already too late. With a single, swift, clean sweep, the Tex decapitated him using nothing but a shovel. Blood sprayed across Texas's face as Gileiam's head fell. As the nearby bandits cried out in stunned shock at Gileiam's death, 2 more lunged from behind, but he spun, struck once, and felled them instantly. Blood splattered again as their bodies crashed to the ground. Tex stood over the fallen, coldly declaring that a shovel was more than enough. One of the remaining enemies trembled as recognition struck. Tex, the demon, an A-ranked venture. He asked why someone of that level would be in such a remote town, and Tex only smiled, amused that he'd been recognized. Terrified, the man spun and bolted, shouting that they didn't stand a chance of winning. The text snapped him straight. He wasn't a demon, only a weirdo. And with that, he hurled the shovel like a spear. It seems the man's neck is clean. Tex turned to the last bandit, his gaze a silent dare. The man, overwhelmed with fear, dropped his weapon and surrendered. Then Tex casually suggested taking a stroll. Meanwhile, Nexon asked Rita how far they still needed to go. She pointed to a building just around the corner with its bearded doors set inward, and as they neared, they both stopped at the sudden, loud commotion. The door burst open and Riggs poured out, frantic as they scanned the area. Next, because something felt wrong and a worried voice spoke up, Rita nodded in agreement as her unease grew. Riggs spotted Rita and rushed over in a panic, gasping that Mirren, who had been watching the end, was gone. He jabbed a finger at the far end, panic in his voice as he blurted that it was completely empty. And Rita went stiff with disbelief, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. The group burst inside, only to find the place ransacked and empty, and Nexon muttered how terrible it was. Rita scanned the room, saw something on the floor, and he bent to pick up a dark, menacing poster with Mina and Luna's faces. His face went hard as he whispered the thought he'd been dreading. Clutching the paper tight, he cried out for his daughters Mina and Luna, and they tried to call him back, asking where he was going. Rita, enraged and desperate, spat the obvious. He was going to find his daughters, and Riggs immediately volunteered to go with him, warning that rushing around without a plan would only mean running into more bandits. Rita was too furious to listen, shouting that he had a score to settle. Suddenly, a calm voice cut in, quietly supporting Nixon's logic. Rita spun in surprise when she saw Valerie. He questioned her presence, fearing for her safety, and she told them she had seen bandits riding 4 girls out of town on horseback. Panic slammed into him. He demanded to know which direction they'd gone and insisted they give chase immediately. Over and over, try to calm him, warning that acting alone would accomplish nothing. Text appeared, backing up Nexon's warning. Claus spoke up too, saying going alone would end in failure, and Rita stood frozen, stunned to find them both there. Valerie turned to Nexon and Riggs, her voice urgent as she asked a favor. While they chased the hostages, she wanted them to take the wounded to the end for treatment. She assured them the Amulus family would cover the expenses, and someone immediately responded, "There's no need for that." Living in the town, he couldn't bring himself to think about money when the crisis hit. He read a smile, moved by his words, but quickly added that this was precisely why he needed Rita to understand. If the guild elders found out he was treating people for next to nothing, they'd yank his license, and then Rita and the Adventurers Guild would have to take care of him. Rita smiled more warmly and agreed to the deal. Tech nodded, saying everything was settled. Claw agreed, and Valerie announced it was time to move. But Rita turned to her, alarmed, begging her not to go and warning it was too dangerous. Valerie gave him a sly wink and said that without her they had no way to track the hostages, leaving Rita confused as she tried to ask what she meant. Valerie raised her hand, casting a spell without a sound, and called the magical item Crozy to life. A glowing image burst into being. A bird's-eye view of the bandits rumbling along in wagons with the captured girls. Valerie said she was tracking them with this magic item. A magical crow-shaped sword hovered in the sky, following the enemy's trail. She said her brother had given her permission to help, and without a moment's hesitation she urged the group to give chase. They swung into their saddles and rode out. Claw warned that if the bandits at the hideout proved overwhelming, they'd reassess on the spot. But fortunately, a magic item let them keep watch. And Text pointed out that since so many bandits were attacking the town, the hideout was unlikely to be heavily defended. so he and Claw would take care of the enemy forces, while he told Rita to focus on healing the wounded. Rita agreed, her heart heavy with worry, and his thoughts echoed like a desperate prayer for everyone's safety.